long before men carved names into stone or built the wall to keep back the dark. Something older than either had already learned this truth. The world does not like to be torn. It tears anyway. North of the wall, in a stretch of forest the wildlings called the Haunted, the sky opened without warning, on a gray morning, heavy with the smell of old snow. There was no thunder to announce it, no red comet, no portent a Septon might have written down for later scholars to argue over. There was only a seam of wrongness spreading across the air, a crack of white light that did not flicker so much as simply arrive, and then two people falling through it into a Westeros that had never once considered they might exist. Saitama landed first, feet first, with the mild irritation of a man stepping off a curb he hadn't seen. Tatsumaki landed a half-second behind him, upright and furious, hair snapping with the leftover charge of whatever had just happened, green eyes blazing before she'd even taken in her surroundings. "Okay," Saitama said, looking around at the black trees and the old snow and the strange, ancient cold that had nothing to do with any winter he recognized. "Where's the convenience store?" Tatsumaki didn't answer him. She was too busy scanning the tree line with the flat, assessing hostility of someone used to being the most dangerous thing in any given radius, and finding, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that she genuinely didn't know if that was still true. The trees themselves seemed to lean away from where they'd landed, and not from any wind. They had come through somewhere between one afternoon and the next, Saitama halfway through complaining about a sale that had ended before he got to the store, Tatsumaki mid-sentence in the middle of casually annihilating a rogue esper's psychic barrier 3 prefectures over, and now stood on frost-hardened ground surrounded by trees whose bark seemed to hold faces if you looked at them wrong, and didn't seem to hold anything at all if you looked at them right. Weirwoods, though neither of them would learn that word for hours yet. "This isn't home," Tatsumaki said. It wasn't a question. Her feet had left the ground without her quite deciding to let them. She hovered a few inches up, turning in a slow circle, cataloging. No cell towers, no engine hum, no electrical current anywhere in range of her senses. And her senses, when she pushed them, had a range that could flatten a city block. The silence out here wasn't peaceful. It was the silence of a place that had simply never had those things to lose. "Guess not," Saitama agreed, unbothered, hands sliding into the pockets of a jumpsuit that had, impossibly, come through with him. "Smells like snow. And a campfire somewhere. You smell that?" "I smell decay," Tatsumaki snapped, though even she couldn't quite place what was decaying, only that the air itself felt like it was being watched, in a way that made every hair on her arms stand up despite her not technically needing to breathe the air to survive it. "Something's wrong with this place. Wrong in a way I don't like. Everywhere smells wrong before you find the good ramen spot," Saitama said, and started walking. He did not know, and would not have particularly cared to know, that he had just taken his first steps into a land where 7 kingdoms balanced on the edge of a knife, where 3 young dragons slept curled beneath desert stars an ocean away, where a dead god's army waited in the frozen dark for a winter that had already begun to come, and where nothing that lived north of the wall had ever, in 8,000 years of recorded and half-remembered history, walked so calmly toward it. 3 miles south, at a ranging camp cut into the lee of a granite outcrop, Corin Halfhand woke before dawn the way he always did. Not from any dream, but from the particular, animal certainty that something in the wood had changed. He had ranged beyond the wall for over 20 years. He knew its moods the way other men knew their wives. The ordinary menace of it, the low, continuous thrum of a place that wanted you dead in 100 patient ways, and beneath that, rarer and worse, the specific stillness that came before something woke up. This was worse than that. The birds had stopped an hour before first light, and not gradually, all at once. the way a held breath stops. Corin sat up in his furs and found 4 of his 6 men already awake, already reaching for weapons, faces pale in the gray pre-dawn. "Something's out there," said Squire Dalbridge, a young ranger with more nerve than sense, voice pitched low. "Something's always out there," Corin said, though even as he said it, he didn't believe his own reassurance. He'd felt the cold come down before a white rose. He'd felt the wrongness that meant a White Walker was close, the way the air itself seemed to lean toward you like a starving thing. This wasn't that. This was different, bigger somehow, and stranger, a pressure against the world that didn't feel like death at all. It felt like something that didn't know what death was. He gave the order to break camp and move toward the source, because that was what rangers did. They did not run from what frightened them. They went and looked at it, so that men behind the wall might live a little longer for the knowing. It took them until mid-morning to find the crater. It wasn't much to look at, in the end. A rough circle some 40 feet across where the frost had been seared away down to bare black earth. The weirwoods at its edge, scorched white along one side, as though lightning had kissed them, and thought better of finishing the job. No bodies, no whites, no sign of struggle. Just 2 sets of footprints leading away from the center, one small, one unremarkable, both disappearing south into the deep wood. Corin crouched at the crater's edge and touched the burned earth with 2 fingers, still warm, hours after whatever had happened here. "Dragonfire does this," offered one of his men, Squire Dalbridge again, always quick to speak. "Or wildfire. No dragon's flown this far north in 100 years, Corin said. "And wildfire doesn't burn a circle. It doesn't choose its shape." He straightened, eyes following the footprints into the trees, and felt, for the first time in a long career built on not feeling such things, something close to true unease. Something came through here. Not flew in, not walked up. Came through, like a door opened where there wasn't one. "Magic," said another ranger, older, more given to silence, and made the sign of the 7, though there were no septons this far north to see it. Corin didn't correct him, because he didn't have a better word himself. He'd heard the old wives' tales about the children of the forest and their strange workings, about doors between one place and another that the first men had supposedly used and forgotten how to use again. He'd never put much stock in them. He put more stock in them now, crouched over a wound in the earth that smelled faintly of ozone, in a world that had no ozone to smell. "We track," he said finally, "quiet as we can. If it's dangerous, we watch and we send a bird south to the wall. If it's small enough to kill quiet, we kill it quiet. Either way, Mormont needs to know something crossed into his lands that came from nowhere at all." They picked up the footprints and followed them into the deep wood, unaware that small enough to kill quiet was, of every possible description, the single most inaccurate phrase any of them had ever spoken. Saitama and Tatsumaki, meanwhile, had covered perhaps 2 miles, and their conversation had not improved. "There's no reception," Tatsumaki said, for the 3rd time, floating a few feet off the ground beside him, with her arms crossed, glaring at nothing in particular, as though the absence of a phone signal were a personal insult. "No towers, no signal of any kind. Do you understand what that means?" "Means we're somewhere without towers," Saitama said, stepping over a root with the same flat attentiveness he gave to stepping over anything. "It means," Tatsumaki said, voice climbing, "that either we've been thrown somewhere so remote no infrastructure exists, which is impossible on Earth in this era, or—" She stopped herself, jaw tight, because she didn't like where the sentence went, and disliked even more that Saitama clearly wasn't going to finish it for her, or possibly even notice she'd left it unfinished. "Or we're not on Earth," he said anyway, mildly, like he was noting the weather. "Yeah, figured that a while back. Trees look weird. Air tastes weird. Also, I don't see any bug bites, and I've been walking through grass for 20 minutes, so either the bugs here don't bite, or there aren't any, and either way that's not normal. Tatsumaki stared at him. It was, infuriatingly, a more useful observation than anything she'd managed with her considerably more sophisticated method of actually scanning the environment with telekinetic sense. Fine, she said. So we're not on Earth. So what? So we find food, find people, find out what's going on, Saitama said. Same as always. This isn't the same as always, Tatsumaki snapped. And for a moment, something raw showed through the irritation. Not fear exactly. Tatsumaki did not do fear, but something adjacent to it. A kind of vertigo she wasn't used to and resented deeply for existing. I don't know this world's rules. I don't know what's strong here. I don't know if my telekinesis even works the same way she cut herself off, because testing it seemed both obvious and, in that moment, oddly frightening. What if it didn't work the same? What if the thing that made her Tatsumaki, the strongest esper in her whole world, simply didn't translate to wherever they were? Saitama, who had approximately 0 of these anxieties, because for Saitama the question of whether his power worked was not really a question that had ever occurred to him as a question, watched her hesitate and said, unhelpfully, "Try it on a rock." "I don't need your permission to." Tatsumaki lifted a hand, more out of spite than agreement, and a boulder the size of a small car rose smoothly off the forest floor, bark and moss and startled beetles scattering from its underside, and hung there in perfect obedient silence, exactly as it always had. The tension went out of her shoulders so fast it was almost funny. Almost. "Works fine," Saitama observed. "Obviously," Tatsumaki said, dropping the boulder with rather more force than necessary, splitting it clean in half against a root. But something in her voice had eased, just slightly, the way it does when a person confirms the ground beneath them is still ground. They didn't know it yet, but 3 miles behind them, 6 rangers had just heard the crack of splitting granite roll through the wood like a thunderclap on a clear day, and had gone very still, and then had started moving faster. By the time the sun crossed its low winter arc toward afternoon, Saitama had found, examined, and rejected as inedible 4 separate mushrooms, 1 patch of unfamiliar red berries, could be poison, could be fine, not worth finding out the hard way, and had begun to seriously entertain the idea of just knocking down a tree to see if anything edible was living inside it, when Tatsumaki went rigid mid-air. "Someone's watching us," she said quietly. All the irritation had drained out of her voice, replaced by something colder and far more useful, the focus of someone who had, whatever else could be said about her, killed things that needed killing before. 6 of them, behind the ridge to our left. They've been pacing us for the last 20 minutes. "Huh," Saitama said, unbothered, turning his head toward the ridge with the mild curiosity of a man checking whether it might rain. "You can tell that? I can feel 6 separate masses moving at matched pace, roughly 40 meters out." "Yes," Tatsumaki said. "Unlike you, I actually pay attention to my surroundings." "Cool," Saitama said. "So do we say hi, or do you want to scare them off?" "I want," Tatsumaki said, floating higher, eyes narrowing toward the ridge, "to know what kind of world puts 6 armed people on our tail within an hour of us landing in it." Corin half-hand, watching from that ridge through a gap in the black trees with the flat, professional patience of a man who had spent 2 decades not being seen when he didn't wish to be, felt the small woman's gaze pass directly across his hiding spot and settle there, not near it, not around it, on it, and understood, with the particular chill of a hunter suddenly reclassified as prey, that whatever they had found, it had found them first. "Down," he breathed to his men, though he already suspected it wouldn't matter. It didn't. Tatsumaki's telekinetic senses didn't work on line of sight. They worked on mass, and mass didn't hide behind trees. "They're not moving," she reported to Saitama. "Just stopped, watching." "Scared, maybe," Saitama said, and started walking directly toward the ridge, hands still in his pockets, expression still perfectly, catastrophically calm, because in every world he'd ever set foot in, the correct response to being spotted by frightened strangers was to walk up and ask if they knew where the nearest town was. It would turn out to be, in this particular world, an extraordinarily bad way to introduce yourself to the Night's Watch. But neither of them knew that yet, and the wood held its breath around all 8 of them as the gap closed. The gap between Corin's ridge and the 2 strangers closed with none of the drama a man might expect from a first contact 8,000 years in the making. Saitama simply walked up the slope, over a fallen log slick with old moss, and stopped roughly 15 feet from where 6 black-cloaked men were very badly failing to remain concealed. "Hey," Saitama said. "You guys know where the nearest town is? Or like, a store? Anything with food?" Silence answered him. The specific, ringing silence of men who have trained their whole careers for the moment a white rises, or a walker steps from the tree line, and who have absolutely no training at all for a bald man in bright yellow, asking for directions to a grocery store. Corin Halfhand rose slowly from behind the log where he'd been crouched, longsword still sheathed but hand resting near the hilt, and studied the 2 of them with the flat, careful eyes of a man cataloging a threat before deciding whether to name it one. The man was unremarkable in every visible way. Average height, average build, no visible weapon, a strange yellow garment Corin had never seen the like of, a red cloak that didn't match anything from any culture he knew, north or south of the wall. The woman hovering a foot off the ground beside him was smaller, sharper-eyed, hair the color of new spring growth, arms crossed with the particular contempt of someone who had already decided this conversation was beneath her. Neither of them looked dangerous. That, more than anything, was what told Corin they very likely were. "You crossed through the crater in the wood," Corin said. It wasn't a question. His men fanned out slowly to either side, bows only half raised, the old ranger's instinct to gather information before committing to violence overriding the younger men's obvious urge to loose an arrow into anything that unsettling. "Crater? Oh yeah, guess so," Saitama said. "Some kind of hole opened up. We fell through, ended up here. You know where here is? You're beyond the wall," Corin said slowly, watching for a reaction that didn't come. "In the haunted forest. Sworn brothers of the Night's Watch don't take kindly to strangers appearing from nowhere in our ranging grounds, not with what else walks these woods." "The wall?" Tatsumaki repeated, and there was an edge of genuine cutting disbelief in it now. "You mean an actual wall, a physical structure?" "That's your landmark." "The wall," Corin said again, more carefully this time, because something about how she'd said it, flat, dismissive, like she was talking to a child, explaining something obvious wrong, needled at him in a way arrows and White Walkers generally didn't. 700 feet of ice, built by Brandon the Builder 8,000 years gone, holding back everything that would come south from the land of always winter. If you don't know it, you're further from any home I can imagine than I have words for. Saitama tilted his head, mildly interested for the first time since they'd landed. 700 feet of ice. Huh. That's actually kind of impressive. "It's the greatest structure ever raised by the hand of man," said Squire Dalbridge, unable to help himself, indignant on behalf of an achievement that had just been damned with faint praise by a stranger in pajamas. "Sure," Saitama said, unbothered. "So, food, or a town, either one." Corin studied him another long moment. 20 years of ranging had taught him to read men by how they carried fear, and this man carried none at all, not the reckless fearlessness of a fool, and not the practiced mask of a seasoned killer either, but something stranger, the simple, total absence of the emotion, as though it had never been relevant to him in the first place. That worried Corin more than any blade would have. Castle Black lies 2 days hard ranging south of here, Corin said finally. The Lord Commander will want to know what came through that crater, and I'd rather bring you to him walking than carry you there dead, for both our sakes. But you'll understand I can't simply take a stranger's word that you mean the Watch no harm. We don't really care what you can and can't do, Tatsumaki said coolly, drifting a little lower, green eyes flicking across the 6 of them with an assessment that felt, to every man there, distinctly like being weighed and found wanting. But fine, take us to your commander. I want answers more than I want to stand around in these trees. It was, Corin would later report, the strangest surrender he had ever accepted, offered not out of fear or convenience, but out of what could only be described as boredom. The 2 days south were, for the Rangers, an education in a kind of dread they had no framework for. It wasn't that the strangers were violent. If anything, that would have been easier to understand. A threat that swung a sword, that could be flanked, exhausted, outnumbered. Instead, the bald man walked at an unhurried pace through terrain that had killed Rangers twice his evident strength, stepping over roots and through brambles like they weren't there. And once, when a shadow cat, a huge black-pelted thing the size of a warhorse, starved thin and desperate with the early bite of an unnaturally long winter, burst from the tree line and went for his throat with claws that had gutted grown men, he simply turned his head at the sound and caught it by the scruff of its neck mid-leap, held it dangling and thrashing at arm's length like an oversized house cat, and looked genuinely puzzled by the whole encounter. Is this normal here? He asked Corin. Big cats just jumping out at people? Not cats that size, Corin said, staring at the shadow cat, 12 stone of muscle and claw, held one-handed, utterly unable to break the grip, with an expression he was too disciplined to let fully show on his face. The winter's driving them further south than they'd usually range. Hungry enough to try anything. Should I let it go? Or kill it? Said Dalbridge. Before it, Saitama set the shadow cat down gently on the forest floor instead, where it immediately bolted into the underbrush at a speed that suggested it had learned something profound about its place in the food chain. It's just hungry, he said. Not its fault. Tatsumaki, watching this from a comfortable hover, some distance above the tree line, said nothing, though her jaw was tight. She had not needed to test her powers on the shadow cat, or on anything else in 2 days of ranging, because nothing in 2 days of ranging had come remotely close to requiring it, and some old unwelcome part of her mind kept turning that fact over like a stone with something ugly underneath it. She was used to being the ceiling. In her world, when something needed stopping, people looked to her, and she stopped it, and the satisfaction of that, the proof of it, was the only thing that had ever reliably filled the specific hollow she carried around like a second skeleton. Here, apparently, a bald idiot who couldn't tell a poisonous mushroom from a normal one could disarm a monster one-handed without breaking stride in a conversation about lunch. It was, she told herself, not a big deal. It didn't need to be a big deal. It was, in fact, becoming a very big deal, and she hated that it was. They reached Castle Black on the evening of the second day, its towers rising black and jagged against a bruise-colored sky, the wall itself looming beyond it, genuinely, undeniably enormous, 700 feet of pale blue-white ice catching the last light, like a wound across the horizon. Even Saitama looked up at it for a long moment. Okay, yeah, he admitted. That's pretty big. Tatsumaki said nothing, but her eyes traced the whole vast, impossible height of it, with something that was, despite herself, close to respect. It was the first thing in this world that had actually looked like it belonged in the same conversation as real power. They were brought through the gate under close watch, 6 rangers now flanked by a dozen more curious brothers drawn by the strangeness of the arrivals, and delivered to a solid, low-built hall where an old, heavy-set man with a gray beard and a raven perched on one shoulder rose from a chair by the fire to meet them. Jeor Mormont, Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, had led men against wildling raids, mutinies, and the growing dread of what lay beyond the wall for the better part of 2 decades, and he had learned, in that time, to trust his first instinct about a stranger more than any words they offered. His first instinct, looking at the two of them, the flat-eyed, unremarkable man, the small hovering woman with hair like spring grass, and a stare that had already priced the whole hall and found it wanting, was that the watch had just walked something into its halls that it did not have the first idea how to hold. "I'm told you came through a tear in the world," Mormont said without preamble, settling back into his chair, the raven on his shoulder muttering something low and wordless. "I'm told a shadow cat came at you, and you set it down like a kitten. I'm told 6 of my best rangers followed you 2 days south because none of them were quite certain they could stop you if it came to that." His eyes, pale and sharp despite his years, moved between them. "So, before we go any further, who are you, and what do you want in my lands?" "Saitama," Saitama said. "And this is Tatsumaki. We don't want anything, really. We just want to figure out how to get home. And until then, food and somewhere to sleep would be nice." "You say that like it should be simple," Mormont said. "Nothing that falls through a hole in the sky in this world tends to be simple, Saitama. Least of all in these lands, in this season, with what's stirring in the far north." He leaned forward slightly. "I've buried men to things that came out of that same deep cold you fell out of, so you'll forgive me for wanting more than a name before I decide what you are to the Watch." "We're not with whatever's stirring up north," Tatsumaki said, arms still crossed, tone bored but eyes sharp. "We're not with anything. We got dropped here by accident. If you've got something worse than us walking around, that's your problem, not ours. We're not signing up to fight your monsters." "That's a decision easier made before you've seen them," Mormont said, not unkindly, but with the weight of a man who had watched braver words than hers curdle into silence at the sight of blue eyes in a dead man's face. "You'll stay the night as guests, under watch, while I decide what to make of you. Tomorrow I'll want proof of what you claim you can do. Not tales from my rangers, proof I see with my own eyes. A man who can't be harmed and a woman who can move mountains with a thought are either the greatest gift the walls had in 1,000 years, or the greatest danger it's ever let through its gates. I intend to know which before I send word south." "Fine by me," Saitama said, already glancing toward the hall's kitchens with the singular focus of a man who hadn't eaten a proper meal in 2 days. "Can we eat first, though?" Mormont, despite the gravity of the moment, felt something almost like the ghost of a laugh rise in his chest, quickly suppressed. "Aye, eat first." That night, in a cramped stone chamber lent to them for the evening, Tatsumaki sat cross-legged in mid-air by a narrow window, looking out at the vast dark shape of the wall under a sky thick with unfamiliar stars, while Saitama worked his way through a bowl of something the kitchens called stew, with the contentment of a man who'd finally found food. "You're being quiet," Saitama said, not looking up. "I'm thinking," Tatsumaki said. "About getting home? About all of it." She didn't elaborate immediately, and Saitama, who was used to not getting elaboration and generally didn't mind, let the silence sit. Eventually she spoke again, quieter, almost to herself rather than to him. "Everything here is built around the idea that things can hurt you, that things can die. Their whole world runs on it, their politics, their honor, their gods, probably. And then we fall in and none of that applies to either of us. And everyone looks at us like we're what? Like we're something they don't have a category for," she said. "I don't like it." Saitama considered this while chewing. "I don't know. Feels kind of the same as home. Honestly, people back home didn't really have a category for me either. You get used to it." That's different, Tatsumaki snapped, more sharply than she meant to, and then, quieter. You never cared whether people had a category for you. I've spent my whole life being the strongest thing in the room. It mattered. It was the point. She looked out at the wall again, jaw tight. And within 2 days of landing somewhere new, I've already found someone who makes that pointless without even trying. Saitama actually looked up at that, mildly surprised, in the specific way that meant he'd registered something as genuinely new information, rather than background noise. You're mad about the shadow cat thing. I'm not mad, Tatsumaki said, in the exact tone of someone who was extremely mad. I just don't see the point in being the strongest thing in 2 different universes if it isn't actually strongest. You're still plenty strong, Saitama offered, not unkindly, going back to his stew. Just, I don't know, strong's not really a competition for me. Never was. I just wanted to be strong enough that nothing scared me anymore. Once that happened, I didn't really need anything else from it. That's an incredibly boring way to live, Tatsumaki muttered. But there wasn't much heat behind it now. Just something tired and unresolved that she didn't feel like examining further tonight. Outside, unseen by either of them, Jeor Mormont stood at his own window a floor below, looking out at the same dark wall, a raven's low mutter in his ear, already composing in his mind the letter he would send south to King's Landing come morning. A letter that would, in time, set houses and kings and one small, ambitious Khaleesi across the narrow sea, all moving toward the same impossible truth the Watch had just stumbled into. Something had come through the sky above Westeros that did not fear death. The realm did not yet know it. It would not stay ignorant for long. Morning at Castle Black came the way it always did, gray, biting, the sky the color of unpolished iron above the wall's pale shoulder, and it brought with it every ranger, steward, and builder who could invent a reason to be near the training yard when Lord Commander Mormont called the strangers out to prove themselves. Mormont hadn't announced what he intended. He rarely did. But word traveled through a castle like Castle Black the way cold traveled through stone, and by the time he stepped out into the yard with Sir Alliser Thorne at his shoulder, and a dozen black cloaks arrayed along the walls, there wasn't a man in the keep who hadn't found some reason to be watching. I'll need proof, Mormont said again, to Saitama and Tatsumaki both, before I write south. Proof I can put in a letter that won't sound like a madman's fever dream. He glanced at Sir Alliser. Master-at-arms, set them a target. Thorne, a hard, sour-faced man who had spent 30 years training boys into killers, and had exactly no patience left for anything he considered theater, looked the 2 strangers over with open contempt. A target, he repeated. The boy claims he can't be harmed. Fine. We'll see how a blade feels about that claim. Sure, Saitama said, already bored by the build-up. Go ahead. Thorne drew a long sword. Good steel. Not Valyrian, but sharp enough to have opened a man from collarbone to hip in the demonstrations he ran for Green Boys twice a year, and without much ceremony swung it in a full, committed arc at Saitama's exposed neck. The blade struck skin and stopped, not slowed, not deflected. Stopped, as though it had struck a wall built into the world itself, the impact traveling back up the steel and into Thorne's wrists hard enough that he staggered a full step, sword arm ringing with the shock of it. A thin, high note sang out from the blade. Not a crack, not a break, just the sound of metal meeting something that had simply, categorically, declined to yield. The yard went dead silent. Again, if you want, Saitama offered, entirely unbothered. Not even a mark on the skin where the edge had bitten. Doesn't do anything. Thorne stared at his own sword like it had betrayed him personally, ran a thumb along the edge, and found it, impossibly, still keen, not blunted by the strike, simply refused. Valyrian steel might do differently, Mormont said slowly, watching this with the particular stillness of a man recalculating everything he thought he knew about the shape of the world in real time. "You've got some?" Saitama asked, genuinely curious now. Longclaw. Mormont's hand went, briefly, unconsciously, to the hilt at his own hip. A blade passed down through his own house. Before it came to him by circumstance, neither he nor Saitama would get into that morning. "My own sword. I won't waste it proving a point I've already half believed." "Half believed's not the same as sure," Sir Alistair said, sheathing his ordinary steel with a scowl, unwilling to let the moment pass without at least the appearance of skepticism intact. "One trick with a blunt strike doesn't prove—" "It wasn't blunt," Thorne cut in, flat, still staring at his own undamaged edge, like it had personally wronged him. He didn't like admitting it. Alistair Thorne rarely liked admitting anything, but even his considerable pride wasn't enough to argue with what his own arms had just felt. "I put my whole weight behind that cut. It should have taken his head off. It didn't move him an inch." A murmur went through the watching men-at-arms, the kind that starts as disbelief and curdles quickly into something closer to fear. Mormont turned to Tatsumaki next, who had been floating a few feet off the ground through the entire demonstration, with the visible boredom of someone forced to watch a magic trick she already knew the mechanism of. "And you, what do you want?" she said. "A building moved?" "There's an old grain tower past the armory," Mormont said, after a pause, choosing his test with the deliberate care of a man who understood exactly how much he was about to ask the world to believe. "Empty since the winter stores were moved to the new cellars. Timber and stone both. If you can lift it without touching it, I'll have seen enough." Tatsumaki didn't bother answering. She simply turned, found the tower, a squat, 3-story structure of gray stone and old oak beams some 60 yards distant, and lifted a hand. The tower rose. It came up whole, foundation and all, wrenching free of the earth with a groan of tearing stone and a shower of loose mortar and startled crows, hanging 30 feet above the yard, with the same effortless, contemptuous stillness she'd given the boulder 2 days before. A few loose stones drifted free of its base and hung suspended alongside it, orbiting slowly, entirely under her control, as if she were bored enough to fidget with them out of habit rather than need. Nobody in the yard spoke. Somewhere near the wall, a young steward dropped an armful of firewood and didn't move to pick it up. "There," Tatsumaki said, and set the tower back down with a precision that didn't so much as chip its own foundation stones, the whole structure settling into its old footprint like it had never left. "Happy?" Jeor Mormont looked at the tower, solid, whole, exactly where it had always stood, and then at the small, unimpressed woman hovering above his training yard, and felt something in his chest that 20 years of commanding the watch had not prepared him to feel. The specific, cold vertigo of watching the accepted rules of the world quietly, casually rewritten in front of him. "Aye," he said finally, quiet. "I've seen enough." He wrote the letter that same afternoon, alone in his solar, the raven on his shoulder unusually still, as though it too sensed the weight of what was being committed to parchment. He wrote 3 drafts before he was satisfied, because a letter like this, sent south to a hand of the king already drowning in reports of unrest, wildling movement, and worse, needed to be believed on the strength of its restraint, not dismissed as a commander's fever or an old man's failing nerve. "My lord hand," the final draft began. "I write concerning a matter I would not commit to parchment were I not certain of what my own eyes have seen." He described it plainly: the crater beyond the wall, the 2 strangers who had come through it, the blade that would not cut, the tower lifted whole from its foundation, without a hand laid upon it. He was careful, in every line, not to editorialize, not to call them gods or demons or anything a southern lord could dismiss as northern superstition, only to report, in the flattest language he could manage, exactly what had happened, and let the facts carry their own weight. They claim no allegiance to the Watch, to the North, or to any power south of the Wall. he wrote near the letter's end. They claim only to want passage home, wherever home may be. I believe them sincere in this, though I do not believe sincerity will be enough to keep the great houses of the realm from taking a very deep interest in what has fallen into our lands. I would have your grace know of them before word travels south in less careful hands than mine, and grow wilder with every telling. I do not know what they are. I know only that the wall has stood 8,000 years to keep the wrong things out, and these two walked through it as though it were built of paper, not with malice, but with the simple, unconcerned ease of creatures for whom the wall was never a wall at all. I would ask your grace's counsel on how the watch is meant to hold a line against enemies neither steel, nor fire, nor cold can touch, should such enemies ever choose to be enemies at all. He sealed it with the watch's own sigil, gave it to his fastest raven, and stood at his window, long after the black shape had dwindled south over the wall and out of sight, watching the darkening sky with the particular stillness of a man who has just done something he cannot take back. 300 miles south, in a tower room in King's Landing hung with tapestries of golden lions, that raven would land 11 days later on the sill of a small, round man with a soft voice and softer hands, a man who made it his life's business to know things before kings did, and who would read Mormont's careful, restrained words twice before allowing himself the smallest, most private smile of genuine, delighted alarm. Varys had waited a long time for something truly interesting to happen in this realm of small, predictable ambitions. It seemed, at last, that something had. Back at Castle Black, the days that followed settled into something almost like a routine, as much routine as a castle could manage with two people in it who defied every law the Black brothers had built their lives around. Samwell Tarly, heavy-set and nervous and endlessly curious despite himself, took to trailing after them with parchment and ink whenever his other duties allowed, filling pages with careful, cramped notes about what Tatsumaki called her telekinesis, and what Saitama, when pressed, would only describe as just, training. But what training? Sam pressed one gray afternoon, hurrying to keep pace as Saitama walked the inner yard with the loose, unbothered gait of a man taking a stroll rather than a survivor of whatever ordeal had made him what he was. You must have, I don't know, drunk some potion, or been blessed by a god, or 100 push-ups, 100 sit-ups, 100 squats, and a 10-kilometer run, Saitama said. Every day, for like 3 years. Sam stopped walking entirely, quill hovering uselessly over his parchment. That's it? That's the whole of it? Yeah, that doesn't, forgive me, but that doesn't explain a blade that won't cut you. Or, I don't know what to tell you, Saitama said, shrugging. It worked for me. Sam wrote it down anyway, word for word, though privately he suspected, correctly, as it happened, that no maester at the Citadel would ever believe a word of it, and that the true explanation, whatever it was, lay somewhere far outside anything the Seven Kingdoms' accumulated learning had a name for. Jon Snow, meanwhile, found himself drawn more to the woman than the man, not from any particular fondness, but from the wary, watchful curiosity of someone who recognized a kind of coiled anger in her that he understood better than most, having carried a version of it himself since boyhood. He found her one evening on the wall itself, having ridden the winch cage up alone despite every steward's protest, sitting on the icy edge with her legs dangling over 700 feet of nothing, staring south. "It's not safe to sit there," Jon said, coming up beside her carefully, mindful of the wind. "Nothing here is safe," Tatsumaki said, not looking at him. "That's kind of the whole point of this place, isn't it? Everyone here is one bad afternoon away from dying to the cold, or a blade, or whatever's supposedly coming from beyond it." She glanced sideways at him. "You don't seem like you fit in with the rest of them." "I'm a bastard," Jon said, simply, the way a man says a fact he stopped flinching from years ago. I don't fit in anywhere, really. The watch was the one place that didn't much care. Something in that landed with more weight than John likely intended. Tatsumaki was quiet a long moment, wind snapping at her hair, before she said, "Lo, I know what that's like. Being somewhere you're supposed to belong and it just doesn't take. Is that why you're here? On the edge of the wall, alone, in the dark?" "I'm here because it's the only place in this whole castle tall enough that I don't feel like I'm surrounded," Tatsumaki said. "Everywhere else there's people, watching, waiting to see what I'll do." "That'll get worse before it gets better," John said, with the flat honesty of someone who'd learned not to soften hard truths for people who didn't ask for softening. "My Lord Father used to say, power in this realm never stays quiet for long. Someone always tries to claim it, or kill it, before it can be used against them." Tatsumaki huffed something that wasn't quite a laugh. "Let them try. That's not really a comfort," John said. "It wasn't meant to be one," Tatsumaki said, and looked back out over the dark, endless white to the north, where something ancient and patient was, at that very moment, beginning, for the first time in 8,000 years, to feel something uncomfortably close to concern. North of the wall, in the deep places where the long night had first learned to breathe, something ancient turned its attention south for the first time in 100 years. It did not have a name the way men had names. The wildlings called its kind the Others. The Watch called them White Walkers, when they spoke of them at all, and mostly they did not speak of them, because speaking of a thing gave it a kind of permission to be real that most men preferred to withhold. It moved through the frozen dark of the haunted forest the way frost moves across glass, patient, spreading, inevitable, and it had felt, 11 days past, a disturbance in the world's old fabric that it had not felt since the world was young. Something had torn a hole in the sky and walked through it. Something that did not carry the warm, fragile heat of ordinary life, the heat the others existed to extinguish, one flickering ember at a time, until the world was as still and cold and eternal as they were. And yet this new thing did not carry death's chill either, the particular, correct cold that the others themselves were built from. It carried nothing the old magic recognized at all. No warmth to snuff, no death to claim, no thread connecting it to the world's great slow cycle of life feeding death feeding life again. It was, to the thing that moved through the deep wood, something closer to an insult than a threat, a gap in the pattern, a word in no language it knew. It sent its army to look closer. 3 nights after Tatsumaki sat on the edge of the wall talking with Jon Snow, a ranging party of 8, sent out under Core and Half-Hand's command to sweep the deep wood for further sign of what had come through the crater, found instead something that had, until recently, been a wildling raiding party of some 40 souls. It found them the way rangers usually found such things, arranged, deliberately, in a wide circle around a dead campfire, limbs bent into shapes human bodies did not bend into on their own, eyes open and blue as a summer sky, in a face gone the color of old snow. "Whites," breathed young Dalbridge, backing up a step, hand white-knuckled on his sword. "Worse," Corin said grimly, crouching at the circle's edge without touching anything. "Whites don't arrange themselves. This is a message." He looked up, jaw tight, at the deep black tree line beyond the clearing. "Something wants us to know it's paying attention. They burned the bodies before nightfall. Every ranger knew better than to leave the dead unburned this far north, and rode hard for Castle Black with a report that would, within the hour of their arrival, sit uneasily beside the increasingly strange and increasingly public presence of the 2 strangers already housed within the castle's walls. Mormont received both pieces of news within an hour of each other, and did not like how neatly they seemed to fit together. "You think it's connected," Sir Alistair said, more statement than question, in the war council that followed. "The tear in the sky and this." I think the wood beyond the wall has been quiet with something for 8,000 years, Mormont said. And now, within a fortnight of two people falling out of the sky with more power between them than the whole of the seven kingdoms combined, that quiet has broken. He looked toward the door, beyond which, several floors below, Saitama could currently be heard cheerfully arguing with a cook about the correct proportion of meat to broth in a stew. I don't believe in coincidence in a place like this, Sir Alistair. Something out there noticed them landing. I'd very much like to know if it considers them a threat or an opportunity. It was Tatsumaki, when told of the whites, who answered that question, before anyone else had the chance to properly frame it. Let it come, she said flatly, arms crossed, floating a foot above the war table, with an expression that had gone, for the first time since arriving, entirely serious. Whatever's out there, whatever sent that message, it wants to test us, fine. I'd rather it just show up and get it over with than sit out there in the dark being ominous about it. You say that with more confidence than I'd advise, Mormont said. I've seen what a White Walker does to trained men. I've seen the dead rise and walk against their own kin. This isn't a threat you dismiss because your telekinesis lifted a tower. I've handled things that could level a city with a thought, Tatsumaki said. I'm not scared of your ice demons. You should be scared of something, Mormont said, not unkindly, but with the particular weight of an old man who had buried too many overconfident young soldiers to let the sentiment pass unchallenged. Fear's not weakness, girl. It's what keeps men careful. I've watched careless men die to things smaller than what you're dismissing. Something in that landed harder than Mormont likely intended, not because Tatsumaki agreed, but because some small, unwelcome part of her recognized the shape of the warning, recognized it as a kinder version of every lecture she'd half listened to back home about the dangers of being too certain of her own ceiling. She didn't say anything to that. She simply turned and left the war table, and nobody in the room, not even Saitama, quite knew what to make of the silence she left behind her. The others did not attack Castle Black that week, or the next. Whatever moved them, it did not move quickly. The long night had not survived 8,000 years by being hasty, and instead, the wood beyond the wall settled into a different kind of quiet, a watching quiet, punctuated every few days by another grim discovery from the ranging parties, Mormont now sent out more cautiously than before. A white found frozen mid-stride at the base of a weirwood, as though something had simply lost interest in animating it partway through a task. A dead direwolf, larger than any natural wolf had right to be, its throat opened in a way no blade had made. Small, precise signs, each one a fragment of a message the watch could feel but not yet read. It was during this uneasy lull that Saitama, characteristically, got bored. I'm gonna go look around, he announced one gray morning, stretching in the yard while half the castle pretended not to watch him. See what's actually out there instead of waiting for creepy dead guys to show up on their own schedule. That's an extraordinarily poor idea, Mormont said, arriving in time to catch the tail end of the announcement, tone flat, with the specific exhaustion of a commander who had, in 3 short weeks, learned that neither stranger under his roof felt much obligation to consult him before acting. You don't know this land. You don't know what you're walking toward. Guess I'll find out, Saitama said, already heading for the gate. I'll go with him, Tatsumaki said, unhooking herself from the wall she'd been leaning against, so he doesn't do something catastrophically stupid alone. That is not the reassurance you think it is, Mormont said, but he was already reaching for a raven quill, because if 2 people who could not be meaningfully stopped had decided to go looking for the others, the least he could do was have the letter ready to send south the moment word came back of what they found. They walked north through the haunted forest for the better part of a day, Saitama unbothered by the deepening cold, Tatsumaki drifting a few feet above the snow to spare herself the effort of walking through it, until the trees began to change. The weirwoods thinned and then vanished entirely, replaced by black, leafless things that seemed to have died standing, their bark rimed with frost that never quite melted even at midday. The air itself grew heavier, not just colder, a pressure Tatsumaki felt first as a low hum against her telekinetic senses, the way a held note feels before you consciously hear it. "Something's close," she said, stopping midair. "Big, cold, not like anything I've felt before. It doesn't register like a body, more like a absence almost, a hole shaped like something." "Cool," Saitama said, unbothered as ever, and kept walking. They found it in a clearing ringed by those same dead black trees, where the snow itself had gone strange, not white anymore but a pale, faintly luminous blue, as though moonlight had soaked into it and refused to leave. Standing at the clearing's center, tall and impossibly still, was something that had once perhaps resembled a man, in the way a knife resembles a tool, sleek, pale as bleached bone, its eyes a blue so bright and so cold it seemed to hurt the air around it. It did not carry a weapon. It did not need one. Its very presence dropped the temperature further with every passing second, frost creeping visibly out from beneath its feet across the clearing floor. It turned its head toward them with the unhurried, absolute confidence of something that had never once, in the whole of its long existence, needed to fear what it looked at. Neither had they. For a long moment, nobody moved. Saitama studied the other with the same flat, curious attention he'd give an unfamiliar vending machine. Tatsumaki hovered a few feet off the snow, green eyes narrowed, every instinct she had screaming that this thing was wrong, in a way nothing in her own world had ever been wrong. Not evil exactly, but fundamentally, structurally opposed to the idea that anything should keep living. The other raised one long, pale hand, and the air around it crystallized, genuinely crystallized, ice forming midair in jagged, deliberate shards. Dozens of them, each one honed to a killing point, hanging suspended for a single breathless second, before launching as one toward the two intruders in its territory, with a speed no mortal eye could have tracked. Tatsumaki moved without thinking, pure reflex built from 1,000 prior fights, hands snapping up, and every shard stopped dead in the air a foot from her face, hanging suspended in her own telekinetic grip, quivering with a cold so absolute she could feel it even through the barrier of her own power, a cold that seemed to want to unmake the air itself rather than simply chill it. "Okay," she said, genuinely startled for the first time since they'd arrived in this world, staring at the frozen shards hanging obediently in her grip. "That's actually cold." Saitama, meanwhile, had simply let 3 of the shards that weren't aimed at Tatsumaki strike him directly in the chest. They shattered on impact, not against armor, not against any defense at all, simply against the flat, absolute fact of him, the fragments scattering harmlessly across the snow like they'd struck stone. "Huh," he said, looking down at his unmarked jumpsuit. "That kinda tickled, actually." The other tilted its head, and for the first time in 8,000 years of watching men break against its power, something in its ancient, patient understanding of the world, audibly, visibly recalibrated. It raised both hands this time, and the ground itself began to groan and crack, the deep cold reaching down into the earth beneath their feet, ice spearing upward in a ring meant to trap, to crush, to finally, properly end the 2 anomalies standing so casually in its clearing. Saitama stepped forward instead of back. It happened faster than the other's ancient reflexes, honed against mortal men whose swiftest strikes were still, to it, the lazy crawl of insects, could fully process. One moment it stood at the center of its own clearing, absolute master of the cold, and the silence, and the 8,000-year dark. The next, Saitama's fist connected with the center of its chest, unhurried, almost bored, and the other simply stopped existing. Not dramatically, not with the great shattering, screaming collapse a White Walker's death was supposed to require. Dragonglass through the heart, a whole mythology of specific vulnerability, built around how hard such a thing should be to kill. It simply came apart, all at once, into a fine mist of ice crystals that hung in the frozen air for a heartbeat, before drifting gently down onto the blue-white snow, and was gone. The pressure in the clearing lifted instantly. The deep, structural wrongness Tatsumaki had felt from a mile out, simply evaporating, like a held breath finally released. Somewhere far to the north, in the deep places beneath the ice where the true and ancient will behind the others had watched this moment through its creation's dying eyes, something felt, for the first time since the dawn of its long war against the world of the living, the specific and unfamiliar sensation of being afraid. "That was it," Saitama said, looking at his own fist with mild disappointment. "I thought these guys were supposed to be a big deal. Everyone at the castle acted like they were basically unkillable." "Steel doesn't kill them," Tatsumaki said slowly, still staring at the drifting ice crystals, some old, careful part of her mind cataloging what had just happened, with a precision she hadn't fully applied to anything since they'd arrived. "Dragonglass does. Valyrian steel does." Nobody said anything about a punch. "Guess Dragonglass and me have that in common then," Saitama said, already turning to head back toward Castle Black, mind visibly moving on to the more pressing question of what, if anything, would be available for dinner. Tatsumaki lingered a moment longer, looking at the empty clearing where an 8,000-year terror had stood a minute before, and now simply didn't. She thought, unbidden, of Jon Snow on the wall's edge, of Mormont's warning about fear keeping men careful, of her own insistence that she wasn't scared of ice demons. She hadn't needed to be. That was almost worse. She followed Saitama south, and didn't say much the rest of the walk back, and far to the north, in the cold and patient dark, something ancient began, for the first time in its long existence, to reconsider its strategy. Because the old ways, the slow accumulation of dead men into an army of dead men, would not be enough against something that could unmake one of its own, with the same effort it took to swat a fly. It would need to think of something else. It had 8,000 years of patience to spend thinking of it. Word of what happened in the clearing reached Castle Black within the hour. Tatsumaki, despite herself, reported it plainly to Mormont, unwilling to let the moment pass without the old commander understanding exactly what his watch now had at its disposal, whether it wanted it there or not. Mormont listened to the full account in silence, hands folded before him, the raven on his shoulder unnervingly still. When she finished, he was quiet a long moment before he spoke. 8,000 years, he said, half to himself. 8,000 years. This watch has stood against a war we could only ever hope to survive, never win. And you tell me one of you ended a White Walker with a single blow, as though it were nothing at all. It was nothing at all, Tatsumaki said. For him, then the watch owes you both a debt I don't know how to repay, Mormont said. And I fear, more than I did an hour ago, what the rest of the realm will try to do once it learns the same thing I just did. He looked up at her, old eyes heavy with a weight that had nothing to do with age. Men have killed each other over far smaller advantages than the one that just walked into my castle, girl. Kings have started wars for less. I'd counsel you both to think carefully about who you let learn what you can do, and how. We're not planning on starting a war, Tatsumaki said. No, Mormont agreed, but others might start one around you, without ever asking your leave. He was, though none of them yet knew it, already 3 weeks too late to prevent exactly that. His first letter had already reached King's Landing. A second had already begun its own quiet journey, not from the wall this time, but from a rumor carried south by a wandering septon who had heard, third hand, garbled and half mythologized, of two gods who had fallen from the sky beyond the wall and slain a demon with a single touch. By the time that rumor reached the ears of Tywin Lannister in Casterly Rock, it would have grown into something far stranger and far more dangerous than the truth ever was. And the great houses of Westeros, already circling one another in the long, slow prelude to war, would begin, one by one, to turn their attention north. The rumor took 6 weeks to travel from a wandering septon's fireside tale in a Riverlands village to the small, private study where Varys kept his birds, and by the time it reached him it had grown a life of its own. Gods from the sky, demons slain with a look, a woman who could tear down castles with her mind. Varys had built a career on separating the shape of a truth from the noise wrapped around it, and even discounting for exaggeration. What remained after he stripped the story down to its bones was enough to make him set aside 3 other matters of state and read Mormont's original letter a third time. He brought both, the letter and the rumor, to Tywin Lannister within the same week, choosing his moment with the same care he chose everything. Tywin received him in the Tower of the Hand Solar, papers of state spread before him in the neat, merciless order that characterized everything he touched, and listened to the whole account, without once looking up from his work until Varys reached the part about the tower lifted whole from its foundation. "You believe this," Tywin said. It wasn't quite a question. "I believe Lord Commander Mormont is not a man given to fancy," Varys said. "I believe he would not risk his own credibility, nor the Watch's, on a tale he did not witness himself. And I believe, my lord, that a man who has spent 30 years watching the North for exactly this kind of danger does not exaggerate the danger when it finally arrives." Tywin set down his quill. 2 strangers. No house, no banner, no claim on any throne in this realm. One who cannot be cut. One who moves castles with a thought. He said it flatly, the way he said everything, weighing each word for its usefulness before allowing it out of his mouth. "What do they want?" "By all accounts, my lord, to go home." Varys folded his hands into his sleeves, "which is, I confess, the single most concerning thing I've learned about them. Ambition can be bargained with. Appetite can be fed. A power that wants nothing from this realm at all is a power no one in it can properly control." "Everyone wants something," Tywin said. "They simply haven't discovered what it is yet. Perhaps," Varys allowed. "Or perhaps, my lord, we have simply never before had cause to imagine a person who doesn't." Tywin was quiet a long moment, the calculation behind his pale green eyes running through the same cold arithmetic that had built House Lannister into the wealthiest, most feared house in the 7 Kingdoms. A weapon that couldn't be killed. A weapon that could level castles without lifting a hand. In the hands of the crown, in the hands of his family, such a thing could end the coming war before it properly began, could crush any rebellion in its cradle, could make House Lannister's dominance not merely secure but absolute and eternal. In someone else's hands, it could unmake everything he had spent his life building. "Send a raven to Castle Black," he said finally, "under the crown's seal. I want an invitation extended, an audience with the king, an offer of hospitality befitting their evident stature, worded as an honor, not a summons. We don't yet know how they respond to demands, and I'd rather not find out at the cost of the offer itself. And if Lord Commander Mormont's guests decline, then we learn something useful about them regardless," Tywin said, already returning to his papers, the matter filed and settled in his mind with the same brisk finality he applied to everything. "Everyone reveals their nature in how they say no, Varys. See that the raven leaves within the hour." The invitation reached Castle Black on a morning thick with early frost, carried by a raven bearing the crown's own seal, a stag rampant, gold wax pressed deep and formal, and Mormont read it twice before he brought it, with visible reluctance, to the two strangers who had, by now, spent the better part of 2 months disrupting every routine his castle had ever held. "King's Landing wants you," he said, laying the letter on the table between them. "Robert Baratheon extends an invitation, worded as an honor, though we both know what it truly is. The Crown's heard what you did to the other in the wood. They want to see it for themselves, or want to see you, and decide from there what to make of it." Saitama read the letter with the mild interest of a man skimming an advertisement he wasn't sure he'd act on. "So, what? We go say hi to their king?" "You go, and every great house south of here starts calculating how to claim you before the next one does," Mormont said. "That's what it means. You'll not be the only ones with an interest in you by the time you reach the capital. House Lannister already has one, plainly, given whose seal that is on the wax. Others will follow before you've unpacked your saddlebags." "We don't have to go," Tatsumaki said, arms crossed, though something in her voice suggested she was already turning the invitation over with more interest than she wanted to admit. 2 months at Castle Black had worn a particular kind of restlessness into her. Not fear, never fear, but the low, grinding frustration of being contained in a small stone castle at the edge of the world, while an entire kingdom's worth of politics and power moved somewhere she couldn't see it. "No," Mormont agreed. "You don't. But I'd counsel thinking hard before you decide either way. Ignore this and every house in the realm will wonder what you're hiding. Accept it, and you walk into a viper's nest with open eyes, at least." He looked between them, old and tired in a way that had nothing to do with his years. "I've done what I can to prepare you for what's beyond these walls. I can't do much more than that. You'll have to decide for yourselves what kind of guests you mean to be, in a kingdom that's never once had guests like you." Saitama shrugged. "I mean, we're not doing much here besides waiting around for that tier thing to open back up on its own, right? Might as well go look at the rest of the place while we wait. See if anyone down there knows anything useful about getting home." Tatsumaki didn't answer right away, looking instead at the crown's seal pressed into the wax. Gold, formal, an entire kingdom's worth of ambition folded into a few square inches of parchment, and felt something in her chest that she recognized, uncomfortably, as curiosity sharpened by pride. She had spent 2 months being studied here, catalogued and measured and treated with the careful, deferential caution of men who didn't fully understand what they were looking at. A king's court sounded, at the very least, like somewhere that might actually try to impress her, and some old, unhealed part of her wanted very badly to see whether it could. "Fine," she said. "We'll go, but the second anyone down there tries to actually control us instead of just gawking, I'm done being polite about it." "That," Mormont said, "is very likely the single most concerning sentence I've heard in this castle in 30 years of command, and I include the whites in that assessment." But he was already calling for Jon Snow to arrange an escort south, because whatever else could be said of the two strangers under his roof, he had learned in 2 months that neither of them changed their mind once it was made up. They left Castle Black 3 days later under a pale winter sun, escorted south by a dozen mounted men-at-arms and, at Jon Snow's own insistence, by Jon himself for the first leg of the journey, a decision that earned him a raised eyebrow from Mormont and no small amount of grumbling from Sir Alistair Thorne, but which Mormont ultimately allowed, on the theory that a watch-brother who had spent 2 months in genuine conversation with the strangers might prove more useful as an ambassador than any lord's letter. The King's Road south was, for Saitama, mostly notable for its food options improving with every inn they passed, and for Tatsumaki, a slow and reluctant education in just how large and layered and genuinely strange this world was beyond the narrow lens of the wall. They passed through the Gift, its scattered farmsteads huddled against a winter that had already begun to bite harder than any of the small folk remembered from their grandparents' stories. They passed the crossroads where the King's Road split toward Winterfell, and Jon Snow, riding beside Tatsumaki's low, silent hover, went quiet for a long moment, looking north toward the home he'd left behind, before turning his horse to continue south with the rest. "You could go home," Tatsumaki observed, watching him, "instead of babysitting us to King's Landing. The watch takes no part in the wars of the Seven Kingdoms," John said, reciting it the way a man recites something he's said to himself more than he's said it to anyone else. "But it's not against the vows to see two of the realm's newest and strangest guests safely to a king's court, especially when the Lord Commander asks it of me." He glanced sideways at her. "And truthfully, I want to see how you're received. Whether the South understands what it's inviting into its halls. You don't think they do. I think King's Landing has never once, in 300 years, hosted a guest it couldn't eventually threaten, bribe, or marry into submission," John said. "I think you and Saitama are about to be the first." It was, Tatsumaki reflected privately, an unsettlingly accurate assessment of exactly the kind of trouble she suspected they were riding toward, though she'd have died before admitting, even to herself, that some small and stubborn part of her was almost looking forward to it. They parted ways with John at the edge of the gift, the young ranger turning back north with visible reluctance, and continued south under the Crown's own escort, men in gold-trimmed livery who treated the two strangers with a careful, practiced deference that felt, to Tatsumaki, distinctly like being handled rather than welcomed. It was on the 9th day of the journey south, deep in the Riverlands with King's Landing still a week's ride distant, that they had their first true taste of what the wider realm's interest would actually cost them, not from the Crown, but from a lesser house entirely, one of the countless minor lords whose ambitions had never before had reason to imagine themselves relevant to anything larger than their own modest holdings. Ser Amory Lorch, a hard, unremarkable knight sworn to House Lannister, dispatched quietly and without Tywin's direct knowledge by a cousin, eager to make his own name before the strangers reached court and became too valuable, too watched, too claimed by greater lords to be worth the risk, met their party at a narrow river crossing with 20 men-at-arms and a proposition dressed up as an ambush. "The Lannisters would have you as guests at Casterly Rock first," Lorch announced from horseback, blocking the ford with his men arrayed in a loose crescent behind him, "before you waste your welcome on a drunk king who won't know what to do with you besides drink to your health. Come willingly, and you'll want for nothing. Come unwillingly. You're gonna threaten us," Saitama said, not quite a question, already sounding faintly disappointed by how predictable the morning had become. "Third time since the wall someone's tried this. It doesn't work better the third time." "You'll find," Lorch said, drawing his sword with the confidence of a man who had never once needed to test that confidence against something that didn't bleed, "that House Lannister always pays its debts, one way or another, and it collects what it decides it's owed the same way." Tatsumaki didn't bother dismounting from the cart she'd been idly riding in rather than flying, mostly out of a bored curiosity about what horse-drawn travel actually felt like. She simply lifted a hand, and all 20 of Lorch's men-at-arms found their swords, their spears, and in one unfortunate case an entire warhorse, rising smoothly out of their grip and hovering 10 feet overhead, utterly beyond reach, while the men themselves remained rooted uselessly to the ground below, weaponless and increasingly pale. "There," she said, with the particular flat satisfaction of someone who had genuinely enjoyed that far more than she'd expected to. "Now, tell whichever Lannister cousin sent you that if House Lannister wants an audience, it can ask like everyone else, instead of sending 20 men to rob us on a riverbank like common outlaws. And tell him if he tries this again, I won't be nearly so polite about giving his sword back." She released the weapons all at once, letting them clatter down around the stunned, weaponless men-at-arms in a wide, deliberately humiliating scatter, and gestured for the cart driver to continue on across the ford, as though nothing at all had happened. Ser Amory Lorch, staring at his own sword lying in the mud 10 feet from his empty hand, understood, a beat too late, as men in his position so often did, that he had just made an enemy of something that could have killed every man in his command without so much as raising her voice, and had chosen, instead, to simply embarrass him. He would spend the ride back to report his failure, trying to decide which fact frightened him more. Word of the encounter reached King's Landing 3 days before Saitama and Tatsumaki did, arriving in a dozen different, increasingly colorful versions, and by the time their party finally crested the last hill and looked down on the sprawling, smoke-hazed vastness of the capital itself, the entire court already understood one thing clearly. Whatever else remained uncertain, these were not guests who could be quietly claimed. They would have to be properly courted, properly impressed, or, if it came to it, properly feared. King's Landing, it turned out, was more than prepared to try all three. King's Landing announced itself long before they reached its gates, a haze of wood smoke and salt and something ranker underneath both, hanging low over 500,000 lives packed into narrow streets that spiraled down toward a black harbor bristling with masts. Tatsumaki wrinkled her nose from a comfortable hover 20 feet above the road. "This is worse than the forest," she said. "At least the forest smelled like something that made sense." "Smells like food too, though," Saitama pointed out, already tracking the scent of roasting meat drifting up from some market stall below with the singular focus of a man who had, over 3 weeks on the road, developed strong opinions about the comparative merits of Riverland stew versus whatever passed for cooking in the capital. Their escort brought them in through a side gate rather than the main thoroughfare, Tywin's instruction, relayed quietly, to avoid the kind of public spectacle that might turn curiosity into panic before the crown had a chance to properly stage the introduction it wanted. But even so, word traveled through King's Landing the way it traveled through any city built on gossip as its primary currency, and by the time they reached the Red Keep's outer yard, a not inconsiderable crowd had already gathered at a respectful, nervous distance to see the two people the whole city had been whispering about for a week. The Red Keep itself rose above them in tiers of pale stone and red-tiled roofs, 7 great towers catching the late afternoon sun, and Tatsumaki found herself, despite every instinct toward contempt she'd carried into this city, briefly and grudgingly impressed by the sheer scale of human ambition it represented. An entire fortress palace built not for war alone, but for the specific, layered theater of power that this world seemed to run on entirely. They were received not by the king himself, Robert Baratheon. It was quietly explained by the steward who met them at the gate, was engaged in matters that could not be immediately set aside, a phrase that would later prove to mean he was drinking with Sir Barristan Selmy and had no particular interest in interrupting it for 2 strangers, king's invitation or not, but by Tywin Lannister, who came down to the yard himself rather than sending an intermediary, a decision that was, in its own way, more telling than any formal audience could have been. "Lord Tywin Lannister, Hand of the King," the steward announced, and Tywin inclined his head with exactly the degree of courtesy owed to guests of unknown but evidently substantial power. Not deference, never quite deference, but a careful, calculated warmth that Tatsumaki clocked immediately as performance. "Welcome to King's Landing," Tywin said, his pale green eyes moving over them both with the same cold, thorough assessment Mormont had given them at Castle Black, though where Mormont's had carried the weight of genuine unease, Tywin's carried only calculation, the look of a man pricing something before deciding how to acquire it. "I trust the journey was without further incident, beyond the unfortunate matter at the river crossing. You'll understand that was not sanctioned by this house. The knight responsible has been dealt with. He got off easy," Tatsumaki said. "I gave his sword back." Something that might, on a less disciplined face, have been the ghost of amusement crossed Tywin's expression, and was gone. "I've arranged quarters befitting your stature," he said, "and an audience with His Grace the King, once matters of state permit it. In the meantime, House Lannister would be honored to extend every hospitality the Red Keep offers." "We don't really need much," Saitama said. "Food's good. Somewhere to sleep. We're not here to be honored guests. We're here because we want to figure out how to get home. And apparently that means talking to people who might know something useful." Something flickered behind Tywin's eyes. Not quite disappointment, but the recalibration of a man whose opening gambit had just failed to land the way he'd intended. He had expected, perhaps, some flicker of ambition to work with, some appetite for the obvious grandeur being offered. Its absence was, as Varys had warned him, the single most useful and most unsettling piece of information he'd gathered so far. "Then perhaps," Tywin said smoothly, recovering without visible effort, "the Citadel's own records might serve you better than court ceremony. The Maesters keep the oldest lore in the Seven Kingdoms, accounts of the children of the forest, of old magic, of doors between worlds that predate even the Wall. If such knowledge exists anywhere in this realm, it exists there. I would be glad to arrange correspondence, or passage to Old Town itself, should you wish it." It was, Tatsumaki noted, a genuinely useful offer, and precisely calculated to be one, the kind of gift that cost Tywin nothing and bound them, subtly, into his debt regardless. She said nothing to indicate she'd noticed the maneuver, filing it away instead, as the first real proof that this castle's version of warfare ran through favors and obligations rather than swords. "We'll think about it," she said. "Of course," Tywin said, and bowed them toward the guest wing, with a courtesy so smooth it was almost its own kind of warning. Cersei Lannister found them the following afternoon, in the White Sword Tower's shadow, where Saitama had discovered a training yard and was watching, with mild interest, a pair of Kingsguard knights running drills. She approached alone, golden hair catching the light, dressed in crimson and gold that made no secret of which house she belonged to, and studied Tatsumaki, hovering a few feet off the ground nearby, arms crossed, radiating the particular boredom of someone forced to watch men swing swords at each other for entertainment, with the frank, assessing curiosity of a woman who had spent her whole life being underestimated and had learned to recognize the same experience in others. "You're not what the stories made you out to be," Cersei said, without preamble. "The whole city's decided you're either gods or monsters. You seem, mostly, unimpressed." "Most of what I've seen here is unimpressive," Tatsumaki said. "No offense, none taken. I've thought the same thing about most of this court since I was 12 years old." Cersei's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You have power no one here can match. I'd think that would earn you some patience for the rest of us, rather than contempt." "It's not contempt for the power," Tatsumaki said, after a moment, surprising herself slightly with how much truth she let into the answer. "It's contempt for the way everyone here uses it. Half your court spent the last day trying to figure out which of us to marry, bribe, or threaten into an alliance, like we're just pieces. Nobody's asked what we actually want." "Welcome to being a woman with power in this realm," Cersei said, dry and sharp. "I've spent my entire life being a piece other people move around a board they think they're the only ones playing. A crown on my head, and men still speak past me to my husband, my father, my brother, anyone but me, as though the throne I sit beside is decoration rather than substance." She studied Tatsumaki more closely. "You, at least. They can't simply speak past. That's not nothing here." It was, Tatsumaki realized with faint surprise, the first genuinely honest thing anyone in this city had said to her. Not a courtesy, not a calculation dressed as warmth, but something closer to an actual, unguarded truth offered between two people who recognized, however differently, the specific exhaustion of being powerful and unheard at once. "What do you actually want?" Tatsumaki asked. "Out of all this maneuvering, not what your house wants. You." Cersei was quiet a long moment, gold hair stirring in the wind off the bay, before she answered, and when she did, her voice had lost some of its practiced polish. "I want to matter on my own terms for once, instead of everyone else's. I don't imagine that's so different from what you want." "No," Tatsumaki admitted. "It isn't." They didn't become friends exactly in the weeks that followed. Tatsumaki was too wary of this whole court's games to fully lower her guard with anyone in it, and Cersei was too practiced in the art of using people to ever entirely stop calculating, even with someone she found herself, unexpectedly, respecting. But something like a wary understanding grew between them regardless. The specific kinship of two women who had each, in their own vastly different worlds, learned the same hard lesson about being underestimated, and then resented for proving the underestimation wrong. Saitama, for his part, found the politics of King's Landing almost entirely uninteresting, and instead spent his weeks in the capital, doing what he generally did wherever he went, eating everything the city's kitchens and street vendors had to offer, wandering the maze of Flea Bottom's markets with a curiosity that unsettled the gold cloaks assigned to quietly shadow him, and occasionally, almost by accident, solving problems that had nothing to do with grand strategy at all. It was in his third week in the capital that he wandered, half by chance, into a burning tenement in Flea Bottom, an old building gone up fast in the dry autumn wind, 3 families trapped on the upper floors, while the gold cloaks below argued about whether the structure was worth the risk of entry, and simply walked in through the front door, up through 2 floors of smoke and collapsing timber, and carried out 6 people, one at a time, without so much as singeing his jumpsuit, before the building fully came down behind him. He didn't think much of it. He set the last child down in her mother's arms, waved off the crowd's stunned, grateful shouting with mild embarrassment, and went to go find something to eat, because rescues always made him hungry. But Flea Bottom remembered. Within a day, the story had spread through every alley and tavern in the city's poorer quarters. Not the version the great houses were telling, of gods or weapons or political leverage, but a simpler one. A stranger had walked into fire without fear, and pulled 6 people out of it, and asked for nothing in return. Not gold, not gratitude, not even his name remembered correctly half the time. It was the first time in Westeros that ordinary people, not lords, not kings, not maesters cataloging power for its usefulness, had decided, on their own and for their own reasons, exactly what they thought of Saitama. And what they thought, increasingly, whispered from doorway to doorway across the poorest square miles of the capital, was that whatever the great houses wanted to make of him, the small folk of King's Landing had already claimed him as something closer to their own. It was a fact that would matter more, in the turn still to come, than either Saitama or the great lords currently maneuvering around him yet understood. The audience with the king came 9 days later, delayed twice by matters Robert Baratheon considered more pressing: a hunt, a tourney dispute, a night of drinking that ran long enough to swallow the following morning whole, until Tywin, with the quiet, relentless patience of a man used to managing kings who didn't want managing, finally maneuvered the matter onto the small council's agenda, in a form Robert couldn't easily wave off a third time. The throne room received them at midday, sunlight slanting down through high windows onto the Iron Throne's black, jagged silhouette, its surface still bristling with the fused and half-melted blades of 1,000 surrendered swords. Robert Baratheon sat it the way he sat most things, heavily, restlessly, a big man gone soft with drink and disinterest but still carrying, somewhere beneath the excess, the ghost of the warrior who had once ended a dynasty with a single hammer blow. "So," Robert said, looking down at the two of them from the throne's height with open, unguarded curiosity. "The first person at court," Tatsumaki noted. who hadn't bothered disguising his interest as anything else. "You're the two who walked out of the sky and killed one of the others with a punch. Half my council's been wetting themselves about you for a month." "Something like that," Saitama said. "I like a straight answer," Robert said, and for a moment something almost warm crossed his heavy, weathered face. "Gods, you should have seen my council trying to decide how to word an invitation to you. Half of them wanted to offer you titles. Varys wanted riddles. Tywin wanted whatever gets him what he wants, same as always." He waved a hand at the small council arrayed along the dais below him. Tywin's face carefully neutral, Varys's carefully pleasant. A scattering of others Tatsumaki hadn't yet bothered learning the names of. "I told them all the same thing I'll tell you now. I don't much care what you are, so long as you're not planning to sit on my throne or burn down my kingdom. You want to stay, there's a place for you. You want to go home, I wish you luck finding the way, and my maesters at the Citadel are yours to pick apart for whatever's useful in their books. That's the whole of what I've got to offer, and I won't pretend it's more than it is." It was, Tatsumaki thought, disarmingly honest for a king. More honest, certainly, than anything Tywin or Cersei had offered her in 3 weeks of careful court maneuvering. And she found herself, despite every wary instinct she'd built up in this city, almost liking him for it. "We just want to get home," she said. "That's it. We're not interested in your throne or your wars or whatever half your court's been scheming about behind our backs." "Good," Robert said, with real feeling. "Gods know I've got enough throne and wars of my own without borrowing trouble from wherever you two crawled out of." He shifted on the great, uncomfortable seat, wincing slightly. "Though I'll say, if half of what I hear about the North is true, about what's stirring beyond that wall, I wouldn't turn down help I didn't have to beg for. Man who killed one of those ice bastards with his fist is worth more to this realm than every knight I've got combined, whether he wants the job or not." "We're not signing up for anyone's war," Tatsumaki said, more sharply than she'd intended, old instincts flaring at even the gentlest version of the pressure she'd been fending off since the riverbank. "Didn't say you had to," Robert said, unbothered by the sharpness, in the manner of a man who'd faced down far worse tempers than hers across this same throne room. "Just said I wouldn't turn it down if it came. That's different from asking for it." He looked between them a moment longer, something more thoughtful settling behind the bluster. "You know, most folk who come through my gates want something from me the moment they walk in. Land, gold, a marriage, a favor. You two are the first ones in longer than I can remember who genuinely don't seem to give a damn about any of it. Makes a man almost trust you." "Almost," Tywin said quietly from the dais, the single word carrying more weight than the whole rest of the audience combined, and Robert waved an irritated hand at him without looking away from his guests. "Almost," Robert agreed, with a short, rough laugh. "This is King's Landing. Nobody trusts anybody all the way here, not even me, not even my own wife most days. But I'll extend what trust I can. Stay as long as you like. Go when you're ready. And if that wall trouble ever comes knocking properly, I hope to every god in the seven that you're still somewhere close enough to lend a hand, whether it's your fight or not." It was, in its rough, unpolished way, the single most genuine offer either of them had received since falling through the sky above the haunted forest. No strings, no calculation, just a tired king's honest hope that decency might, for once, arrive uninvited, and stay of its own free will. Across the narrow sea, in a city of red brick and slave chains far removed from the Red Keep's careful maneuvering, a very different kind of power was beginning to stir. Daenerys Targaryen had grown, in the months since her brother's death, at the hands of her own Khaal's molten gold, into something the Dothraki plains had never quite produced before, a queen without a kingdom, gathering the fragments of a broken Khalasar around 3 small dragons that grew larger and hungrier and more capable of real fire with every passing week. She had not yet heard, in any detail that mattered, of the strangers who had fallen out of the sky above the wall. Essos moved to its own rhythms, and the affairs of a distant northern kingdom's gossip traveled slowly across the narrow sea. But Sir Jorah Mormont had heard. He received the letter from his own father, a rare, careful correspondence between an exiled son and the commander who had once been forced to send him from Westeros's shores for a crime neither of them spoke of anymore, and read it twice by lamplight in his tent, outside a half-ruined Dothraki town. The account of the crater, the crossed blade, the tower lifted whole from its foundation, settling into him with the particular weight of a man who understood, better than most in Essos, exactly how much the ground beneath the Seven Kingdoms had just shifted. He brought the letter to Daenerys the following morning, and watched her read it with the same careful, searching attention she gave everything now, the hard-won caution of a girl who had learned, at great cost, not to trust easy gifts or easy answers. "Two people who cannot be killed," she said slowly, handing the letter back. "And you believe your father." "I believe my father has never once lied to the Watch's own reports, Khaleesi," Jorah said. "Whatever else he isn't a man given to fantasy." Daenerys was quiet a long moment, looking out over the ruined town toward the horizon, where somewhere far beyond it lay a kingdom she had never seen, and had spent her whole life being told, by everyone who claimed to love her, that she was destined to reclaim. "If this is true," she said finally, "then whoever sits the Iron Throne when I return will have more to answer for than an old usurper's crimes. They'll have to answer for what they did or didn't do with a power like that sitting in their own capital. Or," Jorah said carefully, "it's a power that might be won as an ally rather than fought as an enemy, Khaleesi, if the right hand reaches for it first, with honesty instead of threats." Something in Daenerys's face sharpened at that. Not quite ambition, not yet, but the first careful turning of a mind that had spent its whole life being told what it could never have, now considering, for the first time, a possibility nobody had offered her before. Not conquest by fire and blood alone, but conquest made easier, made kinder, by allies who wanted nothing from her but the truth of who she actually was. "When my dragons are grown," she said slowly, "and Westeros is close enough to reach, I want to know more about these two, not as weapons to claim, as people to meet honestly, before anyone else convinces them Targaryens are only ever the thing you fear." It was a small decision, made quietly in a ruined town on the edge of the Dothraki Sea, months and an ocean away from anyone who might have known its weight. But it would matter, in time, more than almost anything else decided in King's Landing's throne room that same season, because while Tywin Lannister calculated leverage, and Robert Baratheon offered rough, honest welcome, it would be the exiled queen across the narrow sea who first imagined treating the strangers not as a prize to be won, but as people whose choice might actually be earned. Back in King's Landing that same evening, Tatsumaki found herself once more on a high place looking out over a city she still didn't fully trust. This time the Red Keep's own battlements rather than the wall's icy edge. King's Landing's smoke and torchlight spread below her instead of the endless dark beyond the haunted forest. Saitama found her there, trailing the smell of some new street food he'd discovered, and settled onto the stone beside her, without much ceremony. "You're doing the quiet thing again," he observed. "I'm thinking," Tatsumaki said, echoing almost exactly what she'd told him 2 months and half a kingdom ago, at Castle Black's narrow window. "Everyone here wants something from us." The king was almost honest about not wanting anything, and even that felt like it was building towards something eventually. "Maybe it wasn't," Saitama said. "Maybe he just meant it." "Nobody just means it here," Tatsumaki said, though there was less conviction in it than there'd been at the wall. "That's the whole point of this place. Everyone's playing an angle." "You're playing an angle too, though," Saitama pointed out, not unkindly. deciding not to trust anybody. That's still a choice you're making about how to handle all this. Not that different from them deciding to scheme, just the opposite direction. Tatsumaki opened her mouth to argue and then, unexpectedly, found she didn't have a ready answer for that. She looked out over the torchlit sprawl of the city instead, thinking of Cersei's raw honesty about being spoken past, of Robert's rough, unpolished welcome, of the strange, unbidden warmth she'd felt watching Fleabottom's people speak Saitama's name in the market that morning like he actually belonged to them. "I don't know what I want out of any of this," she admitted, quieter than she meant to. "Back home I always knew. Be the strongest. Handle whatever needed handling. Here, I don't even know what handling things is supposed to look like." "You'll figure it out," Saitama said, with the particular, uncomplicated confidence of a man who had never once found the question especially difficult himself. "Or you won't, and that's fine too. Not everything needs a plan." It wasn't much of an answer, by the standards of a court built entirely on plans within plans. But something in its simplicity settled a little of the restless static that had been building in Tatsumaki's chest since the moment they'd fallen through that tear in the sky. And for the first time since landing in this world, she let herself sit in the quiet a while longer without needing to turn it into a problem to be solved. Far below, unseen by either of them, a raven left the rookery bound for Casterly Rock, carrying Tywin's private assessment of the audience. 3 careful pages weighing every word the strangers had spoken, every silence, every flicker of expression, building toward a conclusion he had not yet shared, even with his own children, that the woman could likely be reasoned with, in time, if approached with patience and genuine respect, rather than threat. The man, Tywin's letter noted with the flat, unsentimental precision that characterized everything he wrote, might prove entirely unreachable by any lever House Lannister had ever successfully used before, because a man who wanted nothing, and feared nothing, and could be neither bought nor threatened, was not a piece that fit anywhere on the board Tywin had spent his whole life mastering. "He is either the least dangerous man in the 7 kingdoms," the letter concluded, "or the single most dangerous thing this family has ever encountered, and I confess I have not yet determined which. I intend to find out before anyone else does." Across the narrow sea, in a city built on water and quiet, terrible patience, a very different kind of power had also begun to take notice. The Iron Bank of Braavos did not deal in rumor, and it did not deal in awe. It dealt in one thing only, with a singular, ruthless clarity that had outlasted kings and dynasties and entire wars, the reliable calculation of risk against return. When word reached its counting halls, filtered through 3 separate merchant houses, cross-checked against a dozen independent accounts before a single ledger entry was permitted to record it as fact, that 2 beings of unprecedented and apparently unkillable power had appeared in Westeros and taken up residence, however loosely, in King's Landing itself, the bank did not send priests or soldiers or emissaries bearing gifts. It sent an accountant. His name, for the purposes of this errand, was Tycho Nestoris, and he arrived in King's Landing 3 weeks after the throne room audience with a modest retinue, a small mountain of ledgers, and a request for private audience so unassuming in its wording that Tywin Lannister nearly dismissed it as routine business before Varys, reading the same request, quietly suggested he reconsider. "The Iron Bank does not send its own men across the narrow sea for routine matters, my lord," Varys said. "When Braavos takes a personal interest, it is because Braavos has already decided the matter is worth more than the cost of the ship." Tywin granted the audience. Tycho Nestoris, small and precise, and entirely without the theater most emissaries brought to the Red Keep, laid out his purpose with the flat, unadorned clarity of a man discussing crop yields. "The Iron Bank has financed the wars of every great house in this realm, at one point or another, my Lord Hand," he said. "We have financed the fall of dynasties, and the rise of new ones. We do this not from loyalty, which the bank does not extend to any house, but from calculation. We lend to whichever party is most likely to win, and we are rarely wrong, because we account for every variable that matters before committing a single coin. He folded his hands. 2 variables have entered this realm's ledger that were not present a season ago. The bank wishes to understand their weight before any further loans are extended to any house that might find itself opposing them, deliberately or otherwise. You want to know if we control them, Tywin said flatly. We want to know if anyone controls them, Tycho corrected, with the mild, unbothered precision of a man who had delivered far more uncomfortable truths to far more powerful men than Tywin Lannister. Because if no one does, my lord, then every calculation the bank has made about the stability of this realm for the past 3 centuries requires revision. A crown that can be threatened, bribed, or overthrown is a crown the bank can lend to with confidence, because those are variables we understand. A power that answers to no throne and wants nothing the bank can offer is a variable we cannot yet price. Until we can price it, the bank intends to be very careful about which side of any future conflict it finances, and I suspect, my lord, that fact alone should concern you more than anything else I've said today. It was, Tywin reflected privately after the audience ended, the single most unsettling conversation he'd had since the strangers first arrived, not because Tycho Nestoris had threatened anything, but because the bank's careful, bloodless neutrality was itself a kind of verdict. Every house in Westeros understood, on some deep and instinctive level, that the day the Iron Bank stopped being predictable was the day the realm's entire architecture of power became, in some fundamental way, unsound. He did not yet know what to do with that knowledge. He filed it away, as he filed everything, to be acted upon the moment a clear advantage presented itself, and turned his attention back to the more immediate problem of Sir Amory Lorch's cousin, who had proven, despite the earlier humiliation at the riverbank, entirely unable to stop scheming about how House Lannister might yet claim what King's Landing's court had so far only managed to host. Braavos held a second interest in the matter, quieter and far less official than the bank's, and it moved through channels the Iron Throne would never think to watch. In the House of Black and White, beneath the many faces lining its dark and silent halls, the servants of the many-faced god had heard the same rumors as everyone else, filtered, as all things were in that place, through the specific lens of their own singular purpose. Death came for all things, in the end. It was the one true equality the world offered, the great leveling promise that made every life, however grand or humble, ultimately the same in the eyes of the god they served. 2 beings had arrived in the world who did not appear to owe that god anything at all. It troubled the faceless men in a way little else did, not as a threat to be countered precisely, but as a genuine theological curiosity, a crack in the foundational premise their entire order was built upon. A quiet delegation was dispatched, not to kill, not yet, but to observe, to understand, to determine whether the stranger's apparent immunity to death was a fact of their nature, or merely a fact that had not yet been sufficiently tested. The man who came to King's Landing wearing an unremarkable face, a merchant's face, forgettable and precisely so, spent 11 days in the city's markets and taverns, listening, watching, occasionally engineering small, careful tests of his own that neither Saitama nor Tatsumaki ever noticed as anything other than ordinary chance. A loosened cartwheel that nearly struck Saitama in a crowded street and simply bounced off him without incident. A poisoned cup, substituted with careful skill into a tavern order, that Tatsumaki drank without any visible effect whatsoever. The poison's careful, lethal chemistry simply failing to register against whatever it was that made her what she was. The man reported back to Braavos, in the end, with a conclusion that would sit uneasily in the house of black and white for a long while after, that whatever these two beings were, death itself did not appear to recognize them as targets within its purview, not resistant to death, as a strong man might resist a weak poison, but genuinely, structurally outside its reach entirely, the way a stone is outside the reach of hunger. It was not a conclusion the faceless men were accustomed to reaching about anything that walked and breathed and spoke as a person did. Whether it would remain true forever, or whether some circumstance yet unknown might change it, was a question the Order set aside for future consideration, unwilling to act rashly against something so fundamentally unprecedented. But they did not forget. The faceless men never forgot anything that touched, even distantly, on the nature of death itself, and in a city built on the patient, generational memory of an order that measured its plans in centuries rather than seasons, that unresolved question would wait, quietly, for whatever circumstance eventually made it relevant again. Back in King's Landing, unaware of ledgers being weighed in bravos, or faces being worn in her own city's crowded markets, Tatsumaki found her restlessness curdling into something sharper as the weeks wore on. It came to a head on an overcast afternoon in the Red Keep's training yard, where a visiting knight from the Vale, Sir Vardis Aegon, captain of the Erie's own household guard, in the capital on business for Lady Lysa Arryn, and possessed of exactly the kind of proud, easily wounded confidence that made him a poor match for the mood Tatsumaki had been carrying for days, made the mistake of speaking to her the way half the court still occasionally did, with the careful, condescending gentleness reserved for something powerful but fundamentally not quite a person. "Impressive tricks, my lady," he said, watching her idly levitate a training dummy, end over end, while she waited for Saitama to finish an argument with a cook about the seasoning of the day's stew. "Though I confess, I've yet to see this power tested against anything that could truly fight back. Parlor magic against ice demons and frightened rangers is one thing. A blade in a trained hand is another. Something in Tatsumaki, some raw, exposed nerve that had been rubbed steadily thinner by 2 months of feeling, however subtly, like a curiosity rather than a person, snapped taut. "You want to test it," she said, voice gone very flat and very cold. "Go ahead." Sir Vardis, sensing an opportunity to make a name for himself that half the court would talk about for years, drew his sword with genuine confidence and came at her in a real, committed attack. Not the careful demonstration Sir Alistair Thorne had offered at the wall, but an actual, trained knight's assault, full speed, full intent, the kind of strike meant to actually connect. She stopped at a hair's breadth from her own throat, the blade hanging frozen in her telekinetic grip, while Sir Vardis strained uselessly against a hold he had no way of breaking, and for one long, ugly moment, something old and wounded and furious in Tatsumaki wanted very badly to simply crush the blade, and the man holding it into paste, not because he'd truly threatened her, but because some deep, unhealed part of her wanted, needed, to prove beyond any possible doubt that she was not a thing to be tested by anyone, ever, for any reason. She held there a beat too long. The yard had gone silent, every watching eye fixed on her, and somewhere in that silence she heard, with sudden and unwelcome clarity, an echo of every time back home someone had pushed exactly this same nerve, every colleague who'd doubted her, every moment she'd needed to prove her strength wasn't accidental, wasn't a fluke, wasn't something that could be taken from her the moment she stopped defending it. "Hey," Saitama's voice, easy and unbothered, cut through the yard from the doorway where he'd appeared mid-argument with the cook. "You good?" The question, so simple, so entirely without judgment, was somehow the thing that broke the moment's ugly momentum. Tatsumaki released the blade, letting it clatter to the yard stones, and stepped back, breathing harder than the encounter should have warranted. "Fine," she said, He wanted a demonstration. He got one. Sir Vardis, pale and shaken and wise enough, finally, to recognize how close he'd come to something he couldn't have survived, bowed stiffly, and retreated from the yard without another word. Saitama watched her a moment and didn't press, because pressing wasn't really his way. But that evening, on the same battlements where they'd sat a week before, he brought it up anyway, in his own blunt, unhurried fashion. "You almost really hurt that guy," he said. "He drew a real sword on me," Tatsumaki said. "What was I supposed to do?" "Not that part," Saitama said. "The part after, where you kept holding it a lot longer than you needed to." Tatsumaki didn't answer right away, arms wrapped around her knees, looking out over the dark city. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost most of its usual edge. "Back home, everyone always needed proof that I was strong enough, that whatever I did mattered, that it was really me doing it and not some fluke. I got used to proving it, over and over, until I stopped being able to tell the difference between defending myself and just needing everyone to be afraid of me." "You don't need that here," Saitama said simply. "Nobody here's gonna outstrong you, not even close. You don't have anything left to prove. That's supposed to help?" "I don't know," Saitama admitted. "Just seems like it should. If nobody can actually challenge you, there's nothing left to be scared of losing." It wasn't a complicated insight, delivered the way Saitama delivered most things. Flat, unpolished, entirely without the careful diplomatic phrasing the rest of this world seemed to run on. But it lodged somewhere in Tatsumaki that the court's endless politics never had, because it wasn't trying to manage her, or use her, or measure her. It was just true, and offered without any angle behind it at all. She didn't say anything else that night, but something in the set of her shoulders eased, slightly, for the first time since the throne room, and far to the north, in the cold and patient dark beyond the wall, the thing that commanded the others had finally, after weeks of ancient and careful deliberation, settled on the shape of its answer to the two anomalies who had ended one of its creations with a single, contemptuous blow. It would not send another other alone against them. It would send something larger, and it would not send it to Castle Black, where the stranger's strength had already been proven and measured. It would wait for winter to deepen, and the wall's ancient wards to weaken, as they always did in the true cold, and it would send its answer somewhere the strangers were not yet watching at all. Winter, when it finally arrived in full, did not announce itself with drama. It came the way true winters always came to the north, a gradual, grinding deepening of cold that turned the ordinary business of survival into a daily negotiation with death, long before any army of the dead needed to lift a hand. At Castle Black, Lord Commander Mormont felt the change first in his ravens, who grew sluggish and reluctant to fly in cold that bit harder each week than the last, and then in his rangers' reports, which came back with increasing frequency describing white signs scattered wider and further south than any of them had tracked in living memory. The others, it seemed, had grown patient in a new way since the death of one of their own in that clearing, patient not out of caution, but out of calculation, spreading their reach quietly across 100 miles of haunted forest, while the watch's attention remained fixed, understandably, on King's Landing and the two strangers who had left its walls 3 months prior. It was Samwell Tarley, of all people, who first pieced together what that patience actually meant. Buried in the Castle Black Library's meager collection of old texts, records kept haphazardly across centuries by black brothers with more discipline for fighting than for scholarship, Sam found, in the margin of a 200-year-old account of a particularly hard winter, a brief and easily overlooked reference to something the watch of that era had called the Gathering, a period in which white activity had clustered not around isolated ranging parties, but around a single, coordinated push toward one specific, undefended point along the wall's ancient length. "They're not testing us anymore," Sam said, bringing the account directly to Mormont with hands that shook slightly from more than just the library's cold. I think they're mapping our attention, seeing where we're not looking. And my lord, we've been looking south for 3 months straight." Mormont read the account twice, old eyes narrowing with a dread he'd carried, quietly, since the day Saitama's fist had ended an other in a single blow. "You think they mean to strike somewhere we're not watching, while the two who could actually stop them are 3 weeks' hard ride away in King's Landing. I think," Sam said, "that whatever's out there learned something from what happened in that clearing, and I don't think it's the kind of thing that forgets a lesson twice." Mormont was quiet a long moment, looking north through the library's narrow window toward the wall's pale shoulder, visible even from here, and felt the particular cold weight of command settle onto him with new and unwelcome urgency. "Send ravens," he said finally, "to every watchpost along the wall's full length, not just Castle Black. I want to know the moment anything moves anywhere from Eastwatch to the Shadow Tower. And send one south, to King's Landing." He paused, jaw tight. "Whatever quarrel the two strangers have with getting entangled in this realm's affairs, I fear they no longer have the luxury of staying out of this one." The Raven reached King's Landing 9 days later, delivered directly to Tatsumaki and Saitama by a steward who'd been given strict instruction to place it in their hands and no one else's. Mormont's own careful insistence, knowing full well that any message routed through the small council first would arrive filtered through Tywin's calculations before it ever reached the people who actually needed to read it plainly. Tatsumaki read it twice, the easy restlessness of the past week draining out of her expression with each line. "They think something's coming," she said, handing it to Saitama. "Something bigger than the last one, and they don't know where." "Guess we should head back then," Saitama said, already reading it over with the same flat, unhurried attention he gave most things, though something in his posture had shifted too. Not urgency exactly. Saitama didn't really do urgency, but a kind of settled clarity, the particular focus of a man who had finally found a problem worth actually solving. They left King's Landing within the day, declining Tywin's offer of an armed escort with a brevity that left the hand of the king quietly, privately unsettled, not because he doubted their ability to travel safely alone, which by now no one at court doubted in the slightest, but because their sudden, unannounced departure meant House Lannister had lost, for the moment, whatever fragile thread of influence 3 months of careful hospitality had built. "They're not ours to direct," Varys observed mildly, watching from a high window as the two figures, one walking, one hovering a few feet above the road, dwindled north along the King's Road far faster than any mounted party could have matched. "I did wonder, my lord, when you'd come to accept that fully." "I accepted it the moment I met them," Tywin said. "Acceptance was never the difficulty. The difficulty is that this entire realm has spent 300 years assuming power could always, eventually, be made to answer to someone. We are about to learn, I suspect, exactly how much of our understanding of war depends on that assumption being true." He did not yet know how correct that observation would prove, nor how soon. They covered the distance from King's Landing to Castle Black in 6 days. A journey that had taken 3 weeks southbound with a mounted escort, because neither Saitama nor Tatsumaki had any particular need to match a horse's pace, and because both of them, in their own ways, had begun to feel something they hadn't quite expected to feel about this cold, strange, endlessly complicated world. A genuine, if reluctant, stake in what happened to it. They arrived at Castle Black to find Mormont pale and grim in his solar, a wall of maps spread before him marked with a spreading pattern of red ink. Every confirmed white sighting across the past 2 weeks, clustering with unmistakable, deliberate intent around a single stretch of the wall some 40 miles east of Castle Black itself, near a long-abandoned watchpost called the Night Fort. The Night Fort stood empty for near 2 centuries, Mormont said, without preamble, as they entered, understaffed even in its day, and abandoned entirely once the watch's numbers thinned too far to hold it. It's the weakest point along the wall's entire length. Old ice, old wards, nothing behind it but a single garrison town 3 days south that's never once prepared for what might come through. He tapped the map, jaw tight. If they mean to break the wall anywhere, they mean to break it there. And if they succeed, there's nothing between whatever crosses and the whole of the north. How long? Tatsumaki asked. All traces of her earlier restlessness burned away into something focused and cold. Days. By the pace the sign is spreading, Mormont said. Perhaps less. Then we go now, Saitama said, already turning for the door. Wait. Mormont's voice, sharper than either of them had heard it before, stopped them both. You misunderstand what I'm asking. I'm not asking you to go kill whites. I've seen what one of you can do to a single other. What I fear waits at the Night Fort is not a single other. Every report I have suggests a mustering, dozens of the others, at minimum, and thousands of whites behind them. I don't know if even the 2 of you can stand against a force that size and come away unscathed, let alone stop it from breaking through. Then we'll find out, Tatsumaki said, and there was no bravado in it this time. None of the wounded pride that had colored her words in a King's Landing training yard weeks before. Only a flat, settled certainty that had, somewhere in the past 3 months, quietly replaced the need to prove anything to anyone at all. Mormont studied her a long moment, and something in his old, weathered face eased slightly. Some private doubt he'd carried since the day they first walked into his hall finally, quietly resolving. Then I'll ride with what men I can spare, he said. It's not my place to send you into that alone, while I sit safe behind these walls. You'll die out there, Saitama said, not unkindly, just factually. Perhaps, Mormont said, but I've commanded this watch for near 20 years on the promise that we hold the line against exactly this. I'll not break that promise now, because the line's finally being tested by something worth the name. It was, Tatsumaki thought, watching the old man begin calling for his captains with brisk, unhurried authority. The first time since arriving in this world that she'd seen someone choose to stand against overwhelming odds, not because they believed they could win outright, but simply because the alternative, letting someone else bear that risk alone, was worse to them than dying. She thought of Cersei's raw honesty about being spoken past, of Robert's rough welcome, of Fleabottom's whispered gratitude, and felt something in her own understanding of this world shift, quietly and permanently, into a shape she hadn't expected it to take when she first stepped through that tear in the sky. They rode east within the hour, Mormont at the head of 40 rangers and black brothers, the largest force Castle Black could spare without leaving itself defenseless, and 2 figures who needed no horse at all, moving at a pace the mounted column strained to match, toward a broken, ancient watchpost where something that had waited 8,000 years for exactly this moment was already, patiently, gathering its answer. The Night Fort rose out of the winter dusk like something already half dead, black stone gone porous with centuries of neglect. Its curtain wall crumbled in 3 places wide enough to march an army through, the wall itself behind it grown thin and gray with old ice that hadn't been properly maintained in generations. No garrison manned its towers. No fires burned in its long-abandoned hall. It had been left, deliberately and for good reason, as the one place along the wall's entire length where the ancient wards laid down in the Age of Heroes had worn thinnest, not because anyone had chosen carelessness, but because a watch reduced to a fraction of its old strength could no longer hold every mile of a wall built for 10 times their number. Mormont's column reached it as full dark fell, and found the wood beyond it already alive with cold blue light. "7 save us," breathed one of the younger rangers, and for once no one corrected the blasphemy of invoking gods this far north, because what stretched across the tree line ahead defied easy naming by any faith. Dozens of others stood arrayed in the deep wood beyond the crumbling wall, more than any single ranging party had ever reported seeing together in one place. Pale and still as a frozen tide, their collective presence dropping the temperature so sharply that breath crystallized mid-air, and torches guttered low despite having no wind to fight. Behind them, stretching back into the dark further than torchlight could follow, moved the whites, thousands of them, by the low, grinding shuffle of dead feet on frozen ground, a sound like a glacier deciding to move. At the center of it all, taller than the rest and radiating a cold so absolute it seemed to bend the very starlight around it, stood something the others themselves seemed to defer to. Not a king exactly, nothing so simple as a crown or a throne, but an ancient, singular will given shape, the same intelligence that had watched, through its dying creation's eyes, a bald man's fist and 8,000 years of certainty in a single blow. It had spent the intervening weeks doing what its kind did best, adapting. "That's a lot more than one," Saitama observed, studying the assembled host with the mild, calculating attention of a man assessing a genuinely large grocery order rather than an army that could, by any reasonable measure, have ended a kingdom. "I can feel all of them," Tatsumaki said quietly, hovering beside him, her usual boredom entirely absent, replaced by a focus so total it had gone almost still. "Every white, every other. It's not like the last one. This isn't a hole shaped like something. It's a whole field of them, and there's something underneath all of it, holding the shape together, something old." Mormont, dismounting behind them with 40 men arraying into what defensive formation the crumbling walls still allowed, looked out at the host and felt, for the first time in a command spanning 2 decades, a fear so complete it left no room for anything else, not for himself, but for every man behind him who had followed him into what looked, from where he stood, like the end of everything the Watch had ever existed to prevent. "However this goes," he said quietly, to no one in particular, "it's been an honor commanding men brave enough to stand here anyway." "You're not going to need that speech," Saitama said, already stepping forward past the crumbled wall, hands sliding out of his pockets for what might have been the first time since they'd arrived in this world. "Just stay behind us. This one's ours." The ancient intelligence commanding the host felt them approach and did not retreat, because it had spent every day since the death of its creation preparing precisely for this confrontation, refining across weeks of patient, inhuman calculation, a strategy built entirely around the 2 anomalies' single demonstrated weakness. They had, in that first clearing, fought only one enemy at a time. It intended to correct that error immediately, and thoroughly. Every other in its host raised both hands as one, and the night sky itself seemed to shatter, not metaphor, but literal fracture, ice crystallizing out of clear, cold air, in a volume that dwarfed anything a single other had managed alone. Thousands upon thousands of razor shards forming in a single coordinated breath, aimed not at one target but saturating the entire space where the 2 strangers stood, an attack built to overwhelm through sheer, inescapable volume rather than any individual strike's precision. Tatsumaki moved first, and moved bigger than she ever had in this world. She threw both hands wide, and the telekinetic field that answered her didn't just stop the shards nearest her. It swept the entire barrage, the whole vast crystalline storm, catching every fragment simultaneously in a dome of pure, absolute will that expanded outward from her position with a low, grinding hum, audible even over the host's advancing roar. Thousands of ice shards hung suspended in the air around her, quivering with a cold that pressed against even her considerable power like a physical weight. And for one long, taut moment it seemed almost like a stalemate, an entire host's coordinated strike, held perfectly, impossibly still by a single furious woman's outstretched hands. Then she closed her fists, and every shard shattered simultaneously into harmless powder, raining down over the crumbling walls like the world's coldest, deadliest snow. "Nice catch," Saitama said, already walking forward into the host itself. He did not fight the way Tatsumaki fought. No vast, sweeping displays of contained power, no dramatic reversal of an army's opening gambit. He simply walked into the mass of advancing whites and others alike with the same flat, unbothered ease he'd shown a shadow cat 2 months and half a kingdom ago, and where he walked, the host simply ceased. A white lunged for him with rotted, frozen hands, and came apart with a single backhand, dead flesh scattering like brittle leaves. Another, faster and colder and infinitely more dangerous than anything else in the host, met him with a blade of pure crystallized ice, swung with a speed and precision that had ended 1,000 years of Night's Watch Rangers before this night, and simply stopped, mid-swing, against a fist that had already decided the fight was over before it properly began. 40 Rangers behind the crumbling wall watched, in the flickering torchlight, as a single man walked a straight, unhurried line directly through the center of an army that had haunted 8,000 years of Westerosi nightmares, and left, in his wake, nothing but drifting ice and settling frost. The ancient intelligence commanding the host watched too, through every pair of blue eyes still standing in its service, and understood, with a clarity that came a full generation too late to matter, that its careful weeks of adaptation had prepared it for the wrong kind of enemy entirely. It had built a strategy to overwhelm through numbers a threat that could be overwhelmed. It had not accounted for a threat that simply could not be meaningfully engaged by numbers at all, because numbers required the possibility of attrition, and attrition required the possibility of harm, and nothing in its whole ancient arsenal had ever once managed to cause either. It made, in the last moments before its own singular presence finally came within reach of Saitama's advance, one final, desperate calculation. Not an attack, but a retreat, a scattering of its remaining will, backward into the deep cold from which it had first stirred, preserving whatever fragment of itself it could salvage, rather than risk total, permanent unmaking in a single confrontation it had already, correctly, concluded it could not win. It vanished into the dark, and the host it commanded, deprived of the singular will that had held it together, simply stopped, whites collapsing where they stood like puppets with their strings cut, others dissolving one by one into drifting ice with nothing left to direct them, until the whole vast, terrible host that had gathered across weeks of patient calculation came apart within the span of perhaps 90 seconds, leaving nothing behind but silence, and cold, and drifting frost settling slowly over a battlefield that had, in the end, barely qualified as a battle at all. Mormont walked forward through the wreckage of the crumbled wall, with the careful, disbelieving steps of a man who had spent his whole adult life preparing to die, exactly here, exactly like this, and had somehow, impossibly, been spared the reckoning entirely. "It's gone," he said, to no one, to everyone, staring out at the empty, frost-silvered wood where an army had stood minutes before. 8,000 years, and it's simply gone. "Not gone," Tatsumaki said, landing lightly on the crumbled stone beside him, some of the fierce, focused stillness of the fight already giving way to a bone-deep exhaustion she hadn't expected a fight this one-sided to cost her. Whatever was actually running that whole thing pulled back before it got caught. It's still out there. It's just smart enough now not to throw everything at us in one place. "Then it's learned to fear you," Mormont said. "Maybe," Tatsumaki said. Or maybe it's just learned to think instead of just testing. That's worse, honestly. Something that thinks is harder to predict than something that just keeps throwing bodies at a problem. Saitama rejoined them a moment later, brushing a light dusting of ice powder off his shoulders with mild irritation, entirely unmarked by an engagement that would be sung about, in wildly exaggerated versions, in every mead hall from Castle Black to White Harbor within the season. That was actually kind of a workout, he admitted, sounding faintly, genuinely pleased about it for the first time since they'd arrived in this world. The closest thing to real satisfaction either of them had shown, since a punch in a quiet clearing had ended, without any struggle at all, the first and easiest fight of their whole time in Westeros. Mormont looked between the two of them, one exhausted in a way she hadn't expected to be, one faintly delighted by the first real challenge this world had offered him, and felt, beneath the vast, disbelieving relief of survival, the first true stirring of a colder, more complicated worry, that whatever answer the ancient thing beyond the wall chose to send next, having learned this lesson so thoroughly and so fast, might not announce itself with an army at all. It would take a different shape entirely, and the North, for all its ancient dread finally, unexpectedly broken this night, had not yet begun to reckon with what that next shape might cost. The ride back to Castle Black in the frozen dawn light carried a different weight than the ride out had. 40 men who had gone east expecting to die had returned instead with a story that would outgrow itself 100 times before it finished traveling south. The Battle of the Night Fort, men would eventually call it, though Mormont, in his own careful report, refused the word battle entirely, describing instead what he had genuinely witnessed. Not a battle, but an unmaking, an entire host that had taken the others' patient intelligence weeks to assemble, ended inside 2 minutes by 2 people who had barely broken stride doing it. He wrote that report with more care than any letter he'd sent since the first, because he understood, with the particular clarity of a man who had nearly died the night before, exactly how dangerous the truth of what had happened at the Night Fort would prove once it reached the wrong ears. It reached, within a fortnight, precisely the ears he'd feared most. Tywin Lannister received the account in his solar at King's Landing on a gray, unremarkable morning, and read it 3 times before setting it down, his expression giving away nothing of the calculation now running behind it with a speed and coldness that would have alarmed even Varys, had the eunuch been present to witness it. An entire army of the dead, a threat that had haunted every maester's darkest speculation for 8,000 years. A threat Robert Baratheon's own small council had spent months quietly, privately hoping would remain a northern fairy tale, rather than a genuine strategic concern, unmade in under 2 minutes by 2 beings who had, until this moment, seemed content merely to wander his kingdom eating stew and settling disputes in Flea Bottom. It was, Tywin understood immediately, the single most important piece of intelligence to reach his desk in years, and it demanded a response more careful, more patient, and more ambitious than anything he'd yet attempted with the strangers. He summoned Cersei to his solar that same afternoon, not Jaime, whose relationship to their 2 remarkable guests had never developed past wary professional courtesy, but Cersei, whose careful, genuine rapport with Tatsumaki had grown, over 3 months, into something Tywin recognized as the single most useful asset House Lannister currently possessed with respect to the strangers. "You've spoken with her more than anyone else at court," Tywin said, without preamble. "What does she actually want, beneath all the talk of going home?" Cersei considered the question longer than her father likely expected. "She wants to matter for something real," she said finally. "Not to be gawked at, not to be a weapon someone else points at their enemies. She's spent her whole life, in whatever world she came from, being the strongest thing anyone knew, and I think some part of her is terrified of discovering that here, where she genuinely is the strongest thing anyone's ever known, That fact alone still isn't enough to make anyone actually see her as a person rather than a force. A useful insight, Tywin said, though I confess I fail to see how it profits House Lannister. It profits us, Cersei said, with a sharpness that had, in 3 months, grown into something closer to her father's own cold precision than either of them entirely wanted to acknowledge. Because every other house in this realm is going to keep trying to buy her, or threaten her, or marry her into some alliance she'll see through in a heartbeat. The house that actually treats her like a person instead of a prize is the house she'll remember, when it finally comes time for her to decide who she trusts, if it ever does. Tywin studied his daughter with something that might, in a colder man's face, have registered as genuine respect. Then that is precisely the approach House Lannister will take, he said. No further offers of alliance, no further attempts at leverage. Simple, patient decency, extended without any visible calculation behind it, until the day comes, if it ever does, that such decency proves worth more than every gold dragon in Casterly Rock's vaults. It was, in its own cold and calculated way, the single most dangerous strategy Tywin Lannister had ever devised, because unlike threats or bribes, which Tatsumaki had already proven immune to, genuine patience aimed carefully at an old, unhealed wound was a weapon she had no practiced defense against at all. The North, meanwhile, had begun quietly reckoning with a different kind of consequence entirely. Word of the Night Fort reached Winterfell within days, carried not by Raven but by a rider Mormont trusted enough to deliver the account in person, a courtesy extended specifically because Eddard Stark, Warden of the North, deserved to hear the full, unexaggerated truth of what had nearly broken through his ancestral lands from someone who had witnessed it himself, rather than from the increasingly wild rumors already spreading through every northern holdfast. Ned Stark listened to the account in his solar with the same grave, careful attention he gave every matter of the North's safety, and when the rider finished, sat quiet a long moment before speaking. "You're telling me the old stories were true," he said. "Not just true, worse than true. An army gathering to break the wall, and if not for 2 strangers who owe this realm nothing at all, it would have." "Aye, my lord," the rider said. "Lord Commander Mormont bid me tell you plainly, the Watch cannot hold that line alone much longer, not against what's truly out there. We survived the Night Fort because of a mercy we've no right to expect twice." Ned was quiet again, looking out his solar's window toward the Godswood, where his own family's old gods kept whatever silent counsel they still offered a house that had spent generations believing, mostly out of necessity, that the old stories of the Long Night were exactly that. Stories, kept alive mostly to frighten children into respecting the cold. "Send word to my brother at the wall," he said finally, "and send my own thanks north, to whoever stood at the Night Fort in the Watch's need. Westeros has forgotten, I think, what it owes to the men who guard that line, and it seems now we owe an even greater debt to 2 people who never took the black at all." He paused, something old and grim settling into his weathered face. "If winter is truly coming the way the maesters have always warned, and if what waits beyond that wall is even a fraction as real as this account suggests, then the North will need every ally it can find, however strange the shape they come in." It was, though Ned did not yet know it, the first genuine acknowledgement from any great house in Westeros that treated the strangers not as a prize to be claimed, or a curiosity to be studied, but as something closer to what Mormont himself had come, slowly, to believe them, not weapons, not gods, but 2 people who had chosen, of their own free will, to stand for a realm that had never once asked anything of them beyond the accident of where they'd fallen. At Castle Black itself, in the days following their return, Tatsumaki found herself, for the first time since arriving in Westeros, genuinely uncertain what to do with the quiet that followed a fight she'd actually needed to try in. She found Jon Snow again on the wall's icy edge, some evenings later, in nearly the same spot where they'd first spoken months before, and settled beside him without quite meaning to seek him out specifically. "You look different," Jon observed, after a while. "Since you left for King's Landing." "Different how?" "Quieter," Jon said. "Not sad exactly. Just like you're carrying something you weren't carrying before." Tatsumaki was quiet a long moment, looking out over the dark, endless white beyond the wall, thinking of the night fort, of the ancient intelligence that had retreated rather than face total unmaking, of the strange, unfamiliar satisfaction she'd felt catching that whole vast barrage of ice in her outstretched hands, and knowing, with absolute certainty, that she'd been enough. "I think I finally found something here worth actually fighting for," she said finally, surprising herself slightly with how easily the admission came. "Not because I had to prove I could, just because it mattered, and I could help, so I did." She glanced sideways at him. "That's never really happened to me before. Back home, everything I did was about being the strongest. Here, for about 90 seconds at the night fort, it was just about keeping people alive. It felt different. Better, maybe." "That's not nothing," Jon said, quiet. "No," Tatsumaki agreed. "It isn't. Far to the north, in the deep and patient dark where an ancient intelligence had retreated to lick a wound it had never once, in 8,000 years of existence, needed to acknowledge before, something old and cold began, slowly and carefully, to consider an entirely different approach, one that would not require an army at all, and would not announce itself with ice and cold and the grinding shuffle of 1,000 dead feet, but with something far quieter and far harder for two people who could not be harmed by any conventional means to see coming, until it was already far too late to stop. It had learned, in the ruins of the night fort, that strength alone would never be enough. It began instead to consider weakness, not its own, but theirs, buried somewhere beneath all that unbreakable power, in the two things neither Saitama nor Tatsumaki had ever needed to protect from harm before: the people around them who could still, very easily, be hurt. The plan that finally emerged from the cold, patient dark beyond the wall took the better part of a month to assemble, and it was, in its own inhuman way, a work of genuine cunning, the first strategy in 8,000 years of the other's existence, built not around raw power, but around a truth that ancient intelligence had only just learned to recognize: that a thing which cannot be harmed can still, quite easily, be made to watch harm happen to something it has grown to care about. It did not move against Castle Black, where its enemies stood watch. It moved instead against Winterfell, where Ned Stark's household had, within days of hearing Mormont's account, begun quietly preparing to send word north offering hospitality and gratitude, an invitation that would in time draw Saitama and Tatsumaki south of the wall and away from the line they had twice now defended, into a castle full of ordinary people who had no defense at all against what could, if given the chance, follow them there. The others did not attack directly. They were patient now, in a new and far more dangerous way, and patience meant using tools that did not announce themselves as tools of the long night at all. It began with the wildlings. Beyond the wall, in the scattered free folk settlements that had survived the deepening winter through sheer stubborn resourcefulness, whispers had begun to spread of a woman calling herself a warg speaker, one who claimed to hear the voice of the cold itself, and who offered, to desperate clans facing starvation as the winter worsened, a bargain too tempting for some to refuse: passage south through a weakness in the wall's ancient wards, in exchange for a service so small it barely seemed worth naming. She was not, in truth, a warg speaker at all. She was something the other's ancient will had reached and touched and quietly, patiently corrupted over long weeks of subtle influence. A real woman, once, with a real name, before the cold intelligence beyond the wall had found in her grief and desperation exactly the crack it needed to plant something of itself, hollowed and hidden, deep inside a person nobody in the north would think twice to trust. Her name, when she gave it to the small band of wildling refugees she gathered around her promise of southern passage, was Ygritte, and the tragedy of it, a real woman, corrupted rather than replaced, still half aware in some buried, screaming corner of her own mind of what was being done through her, would not become clear to anyone until it was almost too late to matter. She led 40 desperate wildling refugees through a genuine gap in the wall's ancient defenses, exactly as promised, and did not tell them what she carried with her through that gap, hidden inside herself, patient and cold and utterly single-minded in its purpose. Jon Snow found them 3 days later, on a routine patrol south of the wall, meant to catch exactly this kind of unauthorized crossing before it became a genuine crisis. 40 wildlings, cold and starving and frightened, huddled in a shallow cave a day's ride from Castle Black, led by a red-haired woman who met his questions with an unsettling, glassy calm that didn't match the desperate circumstances of her companions at all. "We only want passage," Ygritte said, and something in her voice, flat and careful in a way it hadn't been in whatever life she'd lived before, made the hair on Jon's arms rise despite 3 years of ranging, having taught him to read danger in far stranger shapes than a tired woman's calm. "We mean no harm to the Watch, only shelter until the worst of the cold passes." Jon brought the whole group back to Castle Black, rather than risk turning 40 desperate people away into a winter that would kill them within the week, a decision born of genuine mercy, and one the ancient intelligence hiding inside Ygritte had counted on with cold, patient precision from the very beginning. Mormont, informed of the unusual crossing, agreed to grant the refugees shelter, though something in his old instincts, honed by decades of reading danger in unlikely places, kept him wary enough to have them housed apart from the rest of the castle, watched, until their intentions could be properly judged. It would prove in the end exactly the caution that saved Castle Black from total catastrophe, though not by enough to prevent what came next. Tatsumaki felt it first, 3 nights after the wildlings' arrival, a wrongness pressing against her telekinetic senses that reminded her, with a cold jolt of recognition, of the pressure she'd felt in that first clearing months before. The same structural absence, the same hole shaped like something that shouldn't exist, except this time it wasn't standing alone in a frozen wood. It was inside her walls, inside a woman sleeping 30 yards from a hall full of black brothers who had no idea what they were housing. "Something's wrong," she said, waking Saitama in the small hour before dawn with an urgency neither of them had needed with each other before. "One of the wildlings, it's not right. Feels like the other from the clearing, except smaller, contained, waiting." They found Ygritte awake already, sitting perfectly still in the small chamber the Watch had given the refugees, her eyes open and fixed on nothing. And the moment Tatsumaki's power brushed against whatever was buried inside her, the ancient intelligence hiding there understood, instantly and completely, that its careful infiltration had been discovered a full day before it intended to act. It did the only thing left to it. It moved. Ygritte's body rose from where she sat with a speed and violence that belonged to nothing human, ice crystallizing across her skin in patterns that mimicked, in miniature, the same crystalline cold that had marked the others themselves, and the ancient will speaking through her, no longer bothering to disguise itself, now that concealment had failed, turned toward Tatsumaki with a cold, patient fury 8,000 years in the making. "You cannot be reached," it said, in a voice that layered dozens of tones atop Ygritte's own broken, terrified whisper, audible in every mind within the small chamber, rather than through any conventional sound. "You cannot be harmed. You cannot be threatened. But you can be made to choose. and choice is a wound even the strongest cannot armor against. The wall of the small chamber tore open, not broken, but unmade, ice-consuming stone in a widening circle, and beyond it, in the courtyard, dozens more figures rose from where they'd been sleeping among the wildling refugees, the same crystalline cold spreading through them in an instant, revealing what the ancient intelligence had actually smuggled through the wall's broken ward. Not one corrupted vessel, but a dozen, seated quietly among the desperate refugees over the long, cold days of their journey south, each one now a fragile, human-shaped host for a fragment of the same ancient will, primed to detonate into something between a white and another, the moment concealment no longer served its purpose. Around the courtyard, black brothers woke to screaming and cold, and the horrifying sight of the very refugees they'd taken in overnight turning, one by one, into something wrong and dangerous, and still, agonizingly, wearing familiar human faces. "They're still in there," Tatsumaki said, horror dawning fast and cold in her chest as she recognized, with sick clarity, exactly what the ancient intelligence had built for this moment. The people, Egret. They're still, I can feel them, underneath. It's not possessed them completely, it's just using them. As shields. Yes, the layered voice agreed, almost gently, from a dozen corrupted mouths at once. Kill what wears them, and you kill the innocent beneath. Spare the innocent, and you let 8,000 years of patient purpose walk free into your castle, to spread further before dawn. Choose, strongest of your world. I am curious, at last, to see what your strength is actually worth against a wound it cannot simply punch through. It was, Tatsumaki understood in the space of a single, horrified heartbeat, exactly the trap Mormont had warned her about back at the wall's edge, all those months ago, when he'd told her that fear kept careful men alive. She had spent months in this world learning, slowly and painfully, to care about the people in it. Cersei's raw honesty, Robert's rough welcome, Jon's quiet understanding, 40 rangers who'd ridden to the Nightfort expecting to die and been spared. And now that care, hard-won and genuine, had just been turned into the single sharpest weapon anyone in this entire realm had yet found against her. Saitama beside her had gone very still. Not with fear. Saitama didn't carry fear the way other people did, but with a focus that Tatsumaki had only seen once before, in the moment before his fist ended an 8,000-year terror in a single blow. "There's gotta be another option," he said, quiet, more to himself than to anyone else. There's always another option. Around them, in a courtyard rapidly filling with screaming men and corrupted, ice-wreathed refugees who had, a day before, simply been cold and frightened people asking for shelter. The true shape of the fight the ancient intelligence had finally, patiently engineered, began to close in from every side at once. 90 seconds, that was, Tatsumaki would later calculate, all the time she had before the first corrupted host reached the outer wall and the crisis stopped being contained to a single courtyard. She didn't spend it panicking. She'd spent too many months in this world, watched too many people choose to stand against odds that should have broken them, to let this be the moment she finally cracked. "Sam," she said instead, finding him in the chaos, white-faced and frozen with the specific terror of a man who had never once, in his whole gentle life, expected to face something like this. "The account you found, the old gathering, the one that told Mormont where to look, did it say anything about how the others actually bind themselves to a host? Any old ritual, any weakness, anything at all?" There was a passage," Sam stammered, dragging the memory up through sheer terrified effort, "about the children of the forest, about how they'd bind spirits into hollow vessels using weirwood sap, but reversing it, drawing something out rather than in. I I don't know if that's even the same kind of binding. It's something, Tatsumaki said. Where's the nearest weirwood? The gods would, Sam said. But my lady, there's no time to. Then we make time, Saitama said, already moving. He didn't run at the nearest corrupted host, a broad-shouldered wildling man named Tormund's cousin, ice already climbing past his collar, ancient malice staring out of eyes that had, hours before, held nothing but exhausted gratitude for a warm meal. Instead, Saitama caught him by both shoulders, gentle in a way that looked almost absurd given the raw violence radiating off the thing wearing the man's body, and simply held him still. Not a killing blow, not even close, just an iron, unbreakable stillness that gave the trapped host no room to complete whatever transformation the ancient will intended. Buy him a minute, Saitama said to Tatsumaki. I'll hold this one. It was, Tatsumaki understood in a flash of genuine humbled surprise, not the answer she'd expected from him. Not a fight to be won through overwhelming force, but a fight to be stalled, buying precious seconds for something more delicate than a punch to work. Saitama, whose entire relationship with conflict in this world had been built around ending things in a single decisive blow, had looked at a fight he genuinely could not simply end, and chosen patience instead, because patience was what the moment actually needed. Tatsumaki didn't have time to marvel at it. She turned instead to the other host closest to her, a thin, frightened girl no older than 15, ice already crawling up one arm, and did something she had never once, in this world or her own, needed to attempt. Rather than lifting the girl bodily away, or crushing the crystalline cold spreading through her, she reached with her telekinesis, not at the girl's body, but at the wrongness inside it, the specific, structural absence she'd learned to feel back in that first clearing, and pulled, carefully, precisely, the way a surgeon might draw a splinter, rather than the way a soldier might simply remove a limb. It hurt. She felt it hurt, some feedback loop of the girl's own terror and pain bleeding back through the connection her power had made. But she held on, refining the pull with every ounce of the control she'd spent a lifetime honing back home, until the crystalline cold tore free all at once, not killing the fragment inside, but displacing it, wrenching it out of its human vessel into a raw, formless knot of ancient will that hung, screaming without a mouth, in the frozen courtyard air. The girl collapsed, gasping, alive, human, free, and Tatsumaki, staring at the writhing fragment of 8,000-year-old malice she now held suspended and helpless in her grip, understood, in a rush of fierce and desperate hope, exactly what needed to happen next. "It works!" she shouted, to Saitama, to Sam, to anyone who could hear her over the chaos. "You can pull it out!" "It doesn't kill them, it just pulls the thing loose."
"How many more?"
Saitama called back, still holding his own struggling host with the same patient, unbreakable stillness.
11, Tatsumaki said, already turning toward the next one, some deep reserve of focus and care she hadn't known she still had left carrying her forward. "I've got 11 more."
It took the better part of an hour, the longest hour either of them had spent in this world, by a wide margin, longer and harder than the night fort, longer and harder than any single fight either of them had faced since falling through that tear in the sky. But one by one, with Saitama holding each corrupted host stable, and Tatsumaki performing the same careful, agonizing extraction over and over, the courtyard's chaos slowly, painfully resolved. 11 fragments of the ancient will hung, in the end, suspended together in a knot of Tatsumaki's telekinetic grip, writhing and screaming without voices, in a language no one in the courtyard understood, while 11 ordinary people, wildlings who had asked only for shelter from a winter trying to kill them, lay scattered across the frozen stones, alive, shaken, human, saved. Egret was the last, and the hardest, because whatever fragment had chosen her as its primary vessel had burrowed deeper and more completely than any of the others, wrapped so thoroughly around the edges of her own consciousness that pulling it free risked, Tatsumaki understood with growing dread, tearing something essential of the woman herself loose along with it. "I don't know if I can do this one clean," she admitted, quiet, to Jon Snow, who had fought his way to her side through the chaos with a long sword already bloodied from 3 separate encounters with whites the corrupted hosts had summoned in the confusion. "Try anyway," Jon said, and there was something raw and personal in the plea that Tatsumaki, exhausted and frightened in a way she hadn't let herself be since arriving in this world, didn't have the energy left to question. "Please, she doesn't deserve to be what it's making her." Tatsumaki closed her eyes, reached with everything she had left and pulled. It was, in the end, the hardest thing she had done since falling through the sky, not because it required more raw power than anything before it, but because it required a precision, a carefulness, that ran directly against every instinct she'd built her whole identity around. She had spent her life being strongest by being decisive, by ending things cleanly and completely. This required the opposite: patience, restraint, the willingness to risk failure rather than force a solution that might cost more than it saved. The fragment tore free at last, screaming into the cold, and Ygritte collapsed into Jon's waiting arms, breathing, alive, human, diminished, shaking, carrying wounds no maester's medicine would ever fully heal, but free, and herself, in a way the ancient intelligence's careful, patient cruelty had never actually managed to fully extinguish. 12 fragments hung now in the frozen air above Castle Black's ruined courtyard, writhing and helpless, and Saitama, finally releasing his own exhausted host into the care of 2 black brothers, walked toward the gathered knot of ancient malice, with an expression Tatsumaki had genuinely never seen on him before. Something colder and more purposeful than his usual flat unconcern. "You made them into weapons," he said, quiet, to the writhing fragments that had, an hour before, tried to use 12 innocent, desperate people as tools against something that couldn't be threatened any other way. "You knew we wouldn't hurt them. You counted on it." He raised one hand, not fast, not dramatic, just certain. That was a mistake. He closed his fist, once, and the 12 fragments, deprived of any host to hide behind and any body to protect them, simply ceased. Not with drama, not with the grinding, ancient malice they'd carried into that courtyard, but with the same quiet, absolute finality that had ended their creator's first attempt in a frozen clearing months before. Far to the north, in whatever remained of the ancient will that had spent 8,000 years learning patience, something felt, for the second time in a single season, the specific and unfamiliar sensation of a plan failing completely, and understood, with a dawning and genuinely unprecedented dread, that it had now spent 2 of its most careful, most patient strategies against 2 anomalies who had adapted, each time, faster and more thoroughly than 8,000 years of accumulated cunning had ever needed to account for before. It began, for the first time in its long and terrible existence, to seriously consider whether the long night it had spent millennia preparing to unleash upon the world of the living might, against these 2 specific obstacles, simply never come at all. Dawn broke over Castle Black to find a courtyard littered with melting frost, exhausted survivors, and a silence that felt, for the first time since the tear had opened above the haunted forest all those months before, like something closer to peace than the eye of an ongoing storm. Mormont walked the ruined courtyard slowly, counting the cost with the careful, grim thoroughness of a commander who had learned, across a long career, never to let relief blind him to what a battle had actually taken. 3 black brothers dead, cut down by whites the corrupted hosts had summoned in the initial chaos before Tatsumaki and Saitama could contain it. A dozen more wounded, some badly. The wall of the small chamber where Egret had first turned lay open to the winter air, ice still crusted thick across its broken stones. But 12 people who should, by every reasonable measure, have died as weapons wielded against their will, lived instead, shaken, wounded, forever changed by what had been done to them, but alive, and free, and themselves. You could have simply ended them, Mormon said, finding Saitama and Tatsumaki near the Godswood's edge, where they'd retreated once the last of the chaos settled, both of them wearing the particular, bone-deep exhaustion of people who had spent every reserve they had, every one of those corrupted hosts. It would have been faster, simpler. No one in this castle would have blamed you for it, given what they'd become. They didn't ask to become anything, Tatsumaki said, quiet, still watching the melting frost scattered across the Godswood's ancient roots. They just wanted shelter from the cold. That's not something you punish someone for, even if something evil decided to use it against them. Mormont studied her a long moment, the same wary, watchful, hovering woman who had arrived at his gates 8 months before with nothing but contempt for a world she didn't understand and no patience for anyone who tried to claim her, and found, standing in her place now, something he genuinely hadn't expected to see. Not a weapon reluctantly borrowed by a realm too desperate to be choosy, but a person who had chosen, in the hardest possible moment, to be more than her own strength alone. I owe you both a debt this watch will never fully repay, he said. Not for the night fort, for this. For choosing the harder thing, when the easier thing was sitting right there for the taking. We didn't do it for a debt, Saitama said, unbothered as ever, though something in his exhaustion suggested even he understood the weight of what they'd just survived. Just seemed like the right call. Aye, Mormont said. That's precisely why it matters. Word of what happened at Castle Black spread south slower than the night fort had, in part because Mormont, wary now of how quickly information could be twisted into leverage by lords with their own ambitions, chose his words with even greater care than before. But it spread, in time, to every corner of the realm that had been watching the two strangers with hungry, calculating eyes, and something in how the story traveled, from black brother to black brother, from wildling refugee to grateful family, from Jon Snow's own careful account to Ned Stark's solar at Winterfell, began, slowly, to change the shape of what Westeros understood these two beings actually to be. Not gods, not weapons, not prizes to be claimed by whichever house maneuvered cleverest. Something rarer, and in its own way more valuable than any of the great houses had yet imagined. Two people who had fallen, by pure accident, into a world that owed them nothing, and had chosen, again and again, at real cost to themselves, to protect it anyway. Ser Amory Lorch's cousin, hearing the account third hand in a Lannisport tavern, quietly abandoned whatever remained of his ambitions to claim the strangers by force, understanding at last what the riverbank humiliation should have taught him months before. Tywin Lannister, reading Cersei's own careful, updated report of the incident, revised his private assessment once more, adding a single new line to the bottom of the page in his own careful hand. Whatever leverage this family seeks with them must be earned honestly, or not sought at all. I do not believe, any longer, that any other approach will succeed. Across the narrow sea, Daenerys Targaryen, hearing the account from her own increasingly attentive network of exiled Westerosi contacts, felt something in her own long-held ambitions shift and settle into a clearer, steadier shape. The growing conviction that when the day finally came to cross that sea and reclaim what she believed was rightfully hers, she would not seek out the strangers as tools to be wielded, but as allies to be earned, the same hard, honest way Castle Black itself had earned them. And in King's Landing, Robert Baratheon, hearing the tale from a raven that reached him between one drinking bout and the next, laughed, a short, rough, genuinely delighted sound, and told his small council, with more clarity than he usually managed on matters of state, that whatever else this realm owed those two strangers, it owed them the courtesy of never again treating them as anything less than exactly what they'd proven themselves to be. Tatsumaki found the tear back into her own world 3 weeks later, on a cold, clear morning at the edge of the haunted forest, in almost the exact spot where they'd first fallen through 8 months before. A faint, shimmering seam in the air that Sam, working from the same old texts that had saved them at Castle Black, had finally identified as the natural echo point where the original tear's disturbance had never fully settled. "It's here," she said, quiet, standing before it with Saitama beside her and a small gathering of people neither of them had expected, 8 months ago, to genuinely care about saying goodbye to Mormont, Jon Snow, Samwell Tarly, even a still-healing Ygritte, who had insisted on making the journey north from Winterfell despite her wounds, because she'd wanted, in her own quiet way, to properly thank the woman who'd pulled something monstrous out of her without taking anything essential of herself along with it. "You could still stay," Mormont said, though there was no real expectation in it, only the honest, plain offer of a man who had, over 8 months, come to genuinely value what these two strangers had brought to a realm that desperately needed exactly what they offered. "The North would welcome you. So would half the great houses south of it, though I'd counsel skepticism about most of their motives. We've got people back home too," Tatsumaki said. "People who'll be wondering where we've been for the better part of a year, probably worried sick." She glanced at the shimmering tear, then back at the small, gathered group. "But I don't think I'll forget this place. Any of it. Even the parts that tried to kill you?" Jon asked, something almost like a smile at the corner of his mouth. "Especially those," Tatsumaki admitted. "I learned more about what I actually want out of my own strength in 8 months here than I did in years back home." "That's not nothing." Saitama, for his part, offered a considerably simpler farewell, a shrug, and a genuine easy smile that had, over 8 months, become rarer and more valued than anyone at Castle Black would have predicted the day a bald man in yellow first wandered out of the haunted forest, asking about the nearest convenience store. "Thanks for the stew," he said. "Best I've had since we got here." "That," Mormont said, with something that might, on a face less weathered by decades of hard command, have been genuine laughter, may be the strangest and most sincere compliment this castle has ever received. They stepped through the tier together, hand in hand for the first time since falling through its twin 8 months before, and Westeros, behind them, held its breath one final time as the shimmering seam in the air sealed itself closed with a soft, final flicker of white light, leaving nothing behind but scorched grass, slowly recovering beneath a pale winter sun. Far to the north, in the deep and patient dark beyond the wall, something ancient understood, with a clarity 8,000 years in the making, that its window to strike a wounded, uncertain realm before its greatest, most unpredictable obstacles had even properly arrived had now, finally and completely, closed. The long night it had spent millennia preparing would still come, in its own time, on its own terms, but it would come now against a wall commanded by a man who had twice faced down its worst and twice survived, against a north quietly, permanently changed by 8 months of proof that even the most impossible threats could be met and turned back, against a realm that had learned, however briefly and however strangely, what it looked like when strength chose to serve rather than conquer. Whether that would be enough, when winter finally came in full, no one at Castle Black could say with certainty. But Jeor Mormont, standing at the edge of the haunted forest long after the tier had sealed and the small gathered crowd had begun the slow walk back toward the castle's black towers, found himself, for the first time, in a command built almost entirely around dread, allowing himself something close to hope. Two strangers had fallen out of a clear winter sky into a world that had no place prepared for them, no name for what they were, no understanding of what they might cost or offer. They had been feared and courted and threatened and tested, and in the end, they had simply chosen, again and again, at real cost to themselves, to be decent in a realm that had nearly forgotten decency, could survive contact with real power at all. It was not the ending any maester's history would have predicted when the crater first appeared in the haunted forest 8 months before. But it was, Mormont thought, walking back toward the wall's pale ancient shadow, with the weight of an old debt finally settling into something like peace, very likely the only ending that could have mattered.